Welcome back to the Nintendo Iceberg, created by Invincible Elliott, and today we'll be covering the rest of the entries. If you haven't watched the first part yet, then I highly recommend you watch that first, as this will be a direct continuation of that video. This is also the portion of the iceberg that I'm more excited to cover, since the lower half tends to have the most obscure, and in my opinion, the more interesting facts. So without wasting any more time, let's dive deep into the lower depths of the Nintendo Iceberg. For the longest time, many fans wondered if Nintendo would ever make movies based on their properties again, especially since some of their games could translate fairly well into the big screen. But after the disaster that was the original Super Mario Bros. Movie, released in 1993, being both a critical and financial bomb, Nintendo seemingly gave up on ever adapting their games into movies. But on April 1st, 2008, a new trailer for the Legend of Zelda movie was released online, and it actually looked good. For the time. The trailer would end up going viral, with many fans hyped and thinking that Nintendo was finally going to start making movies once again. But if the date wasn't a dead giveaway by now, it turned out that this trailer was just an extremely well done April Fool's joke by IGN. Despite it being nothing more than a prank, the trailer still had a lot of production value that went into the making of it, looking so good that it generally did fool a lot of fans into thinking that it was the real thing. Sure, the trailer would be laughed out of the room if it was released today, but for 2008, it was pretty convincing. This article goes more into depth about the making of the whole trailer, going over the many hurdles that went into the making of this April Fool's joke. The creator, Sam Balcom, pitched the idea of making a short movie based on a video game to the chief video producer at IGN, which they ended up loving so much that they agreed to fund the entire project. There really was a lot of work done for this short, having to find actors, sets, shooting locations, and a whole crew of 20 people just to make this fun little passion project. One particular detail that I find amusing is that they couldn't film on a green screen, since Link's outfit was green, and would have blended into the background, so they had to find a blue screen, which at the time was a lot harder to come by. Even after they were done, IGN began to grow concerned about releasing the trailer, since it could have gotten them into legal trouble with Nintendo, who, as we all know, isn't exactly the best when it comes to the treatment of fan projects. In the end, IGN went ahead and published the trailer anyways, which proved to be highly successful in not just fooling people, but making a decent fan film on The Legend of Zelda. The video as of now has over 6 million views, as of the writing of this video. Sam Balcom would later end up co-founding a production company called Rainfall Films, which has worked on many shows and movies like Stranger Things, Westworld, and the It movies. Sam will also end up directing another fan film based on Metroid. This isn't the end of this topic, however, as there was an actual attempt at making an animated Zelda movie that was going to be done by Imagi Studios, the same animation studio behind the 2007 TMNT film. Imagi Studios would pitch the film to Nintendo, even going as far as making a proof of concept in the hopes of making a feature film. Unsurprisingly, Nintendo would end up passing on the offer, as they were still reluctant to make movies of any kind. Imagi Studios would end up going bankrupt in 2010 after the box office disappointment of Astro Boy. Sometime after, footage for this proof of concept would leak online. The leaked footage did look decent. I really didn't mind the dark tone they were going for, which looked to be heavily inspired by Twilight Princess. But I was not a fan of the washed out and grey color palette. While Zelda and Link's designs looked fine, I am not a fan of this version of Ganondorf at all. There was also not much information about the story, with my best guess being that it would have been a loose adaptation of Ocarina of Time. But honestly, who even knows if they would have been able to capture the magic of the Zelda series in a 90 to 100 minute film. While it seemed like Nintendo was adamant on never making movies again, in September 2012, a new trailer for the then upcoming Disney movie Wreck-It Ralph was released online, and many were surprised to see an appearance from everyone's favorite lizard, Bowser. While Wreck-It Ralph was a movie that primarily focused on original characters, there were many cameos from multiple video game icons, and just the fact that Nintendo allowed for one of their characters to even show up was a good sign for things to come. It wouldn't be until 2023 that Nintendo would finally make their first full feature-length film, with the release of the Super Mario Bros. Movie, which wound up being a massive hit at the box office. This once again got many fans to speculate if Nintendo would try and tackle a Zelda film next. There was a rumor that Illumination, the animation company behind the film, was going to close a deal with Nintendo to make a Zelda movie next, with some even thinking that Nintendo would be making their own animated cinematic universe. but the CEO of Illumination has denied the rumors. However, on November 8th, 2023, out of the blue, Nintendo would officially announce that they were working with Sony to produce a live-action Legend of Zelda movie. This is something that I would reserve judgment on. While I am excited to see what a potential live-action Zelda movie would even look like, Sony doesn't exactly have the best track record when it comes to making movies. The director seems like a decent enough choice, but once again, we will just have to wait and see how the film turns out. In Majora's Mask, Link is transformed into a Deku by the Skull Kid at the beginning of the game. But before entering the world of Termina, you run into this oddly shaped tree that looks like a dead Deku scrub. Tattle remarks how the tree looks a lot like you, and even looks like it's about to cry. Once you enter Termina, however, the beginning area is sealed shut. Later on in the game, you meet the Deku Butler, who takes you on a side quest to receive one of the many masks in the game, during which the Butler talks about how he used to love going on races with his son, and also comments that you look almost exactly like him while wearing the Deku mask. If you couldn't already tell, the Deku Butler's son passed away sometime before the events of the game, and now his soul resides in the Deku mask, which Link uses to transform. It's a rather dark detail for this game, but it's in line with the rest of the transformation masks, as they all have similar backstories of a character passing away and their souls residing in the masks. While you are given quests to help put their souls to rest, the only one that is never put to rest is the Deku mask. This has caused some to speculate that there's a hidden quest to put the Butler's son to rest, with the only real theory being finding a way back to the beginning area of the game, which was closed off. Normally, speculation would have ended here, but the unique part of Majora's Mask is that the ending does change if you complete side quests. Majora's Mask probably has the most robust side quests in any Zelda game, with many of them changing the ending in some way. In one of the ending scenes, it shows the Butler's son crying next to the tree in the beginning area, which is honestly one of the most heartbreaking scenes in the entire series. This made players wonder if this outcome could be changed in some way, and so, many players began to theorize if you could somehow get back to the beginning area of the game, to which you could then use the Song of Healing and put the sun to rest. But the only problem is there is no possible way to return to the beginning area, meaning there is no way to return to the tree after you have already obtained the Song of Healing. The only way you could re-enter the beginning area was by doing a series of complex glitches that could allow you to clip through anything in the game. But even after doing this and reaching the tree, playing the Song of Healing will do nothing. So no matter what you do, the Butler's son can never be put to rest, which is honestly one of the bleakest resolutions to the game, being that there is none. But that's kind of the beauty of Majora's Mask. For every happy ending we get, there's an equally sad ending, even for Link, who is still left looking for his lost friend by the end of the game. This is probably just a reference to the fact that Mario uses all 4 elements, similar to the Avatar from the Avatar universe. No, not that one. Most of Mario's power-ups give him an ability to control the elements, such as the Fire Flower, which is obviously fire, the Ice and Bubble Flowers being water, the Rock Mushroom, which is earth, and the Cloud Flower, which is air. This is all just a fan theory, of course, since Mario came well before the Avatar was even a thing, but it's fun to think about nonetheless. This is an infamous Super Mario World hoax that supposedly shows off an extremely well hidden power-up. This all stems from a YouTube video, showing off that there's this hidden exit in the top secret level of the game. Upon discovering the hidden exit, this will then unlock a new level named ? Once you enter, you get this message from Nintendo congratulating you on finding their secret laser suit. The power-up is just the mashup of the flower and cape, which is honestly not a bad idea. While the laser suit would end up being nothing more than a ROM hack for the game, this still didn't stop idiots like me who tried for hours to try and unlock the laser suit anyways. What made this hoax more believable though, is that in previous games, there were hidden power-ups that could only be found by finding secret exits to certain levels, so this wasn't too far out of the ordinary. The laser suit also fits Mario perfectly, as him dressing up as a superhero is right in line with his character. Just before Nintendo was set to announce the new console at E3 2005, a supposed leaked video showing off the new console was released online. The video starts off by going over Nintendo's past video game consoles, even having an odd inclusion of the Virtual Boy. It then transitions to gameplay of Super Mario 64 before it quickly transforms into a million versions of Princess Peach's castle. It then zooms around for a while before we finally unveil the name of the new console, the Nintendo On, and showing off that Nintendo was once again going for another virtual reality headset, similar to the Virtual Boy. This was of course fake, as I doubt Nintendo would ever want to make another VR console after the disaster that was the Virtual Boy. Still, the idea behind it is very funny to think about. If Nintendo did actually try to go this route, it would have been a truly revolutionary idea. It would of course have cutting edge technology, like being able to load DVDs in 30 seconds. What a dream. It also showed off a new Metroid Prime game, as well as a higher res version of Super Mario 64 with the scariest looking Mario ever. Again, this video was proven to be fake, as Nintendo will go on to show off the real Project Revolution, which thankfully was not a VR headset. This hoax was made by Pablo Belmonte, who of course was responsible for making other Nintendo related hoaxes, such as Super Mario Galaxy DS and Majora's Mask HD. While doing more research, I learned that this is actually a recreation, as Belmonte's original video was corrupted and had to be remade in a short time. According to the Lost Media Wiki, Belmonte's original video was much longer and showed off more Nintendo's On's features and games, which explains why the video just abruptly ends. He goes on to explain how his hard drive crashed during production and decided to cobble together a video with the remaining assets to publish it before Nintendo's press conference. Despite this video being technically unfinished, it is still a very impressive video for the time, since the production behind it is very high for what was essentially a hoax. The video even impressed Reggie, who was president and CEO of Nintendo of America at the time, which just goes to show you how well made this video was.
Or I guess it was released by a fan out there. You saw it, I take it.
I have seen it.
What did you think of that crazy thing?
I think whoever that fan is needs to call us because he's amazingly talented in terms of pulling together a video. It really looked great.
Nintendo would eventually release another VR headset of sorts with the Labo VR kit, which allowed players to build their own VR headset out of cardboard. The Labo VR headset is really obscure nowadays, but Nintendo did end up patching VR modes for some of their games, including Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, which is probably one of the most seizure-inducing modes you could play on. This is an infamous creepypasta based on the Godzilla Monster of Monsters game for the NES. This story is really, and I mean really long. I remember many creepypasta narrators at the time having to make multiple videos just to cover this one story. Even the creepypasta wiki has the story split up into 9 different pages just to cover the whole thing. I do have to be honest, I have never listened or read through the whole story all the way through because it is very long and I lose a bit of interest about a quarter of the way in. The very basic premise though is that Zack decides to replay an old copy of Godzilla NES and goes into a lot of detail about the entire playthrough. However, he notices that the game is different, describing different kaijus that were never present in the original game, as well as a new mysterious kaiju named Red that stalks him throughout the entirety of the playthrough. Again, there's a whole lot more to this story, and it really is quite the rabbit hole if you want to learn more about it. I'll be listing some videos that will do a better job at recapping the whole thing, much better than I ever could. Links in the description. There have also been several fan recreations of the creepypasta, similar to the games of another infamous creepypasta, Sonic.exe. This is a strange one. So apparently, during the development of Super Metroid, the original death animation included a single frame of Samus being naked before the game flashes to white and the game over screen pops up. This was later cut, since according to the developers, they didn't want to land in hot water with the American market since they had a lot more strict views on this type of lewd imagery, which honestly makes sense. The death animation now instead shows Samus in a bathing suit before cutting to white. There's also no evidence of the naked animation still being in the game's code, most likely meaning that it was cut very early in development. The Nintendo 64 DD was a failed add-on for the Nintendo 64, which added a lot more features to the console, such as being able to use floppy disks and being able to connect to the internet. This add-on was initially announced a year before the release of the Nintendo 64 in Space World 1995. It was initially set to have a lot of games being developed for it, such as Zelda 64, a sequel to Super Mario 64, and even the original Mother 3. Unfortunately, the 64DD was plagued with many delays, with many journalists at the time calling it vaporware, or a piece of hardware/software that is announced but never actually released. The Nintendo 64DD was possibly planned to be released soon after the 64's release, and would have given the system a boost in specs. It would have also allowed games to receive expansions, and even be used as a home computer. While the add-on did generate a lot of interest when it was first announced, the add-on would only ever make yearly appearances at press conferences, with the promise of it being released soon and then being delayed. The main reason behind the indefinite delays was due to the lack of games for the add-on. One of the 64DD's killer apps was set to be Zelda 64, but when development switched over to a regular N64 game, it likely caused the add-on to also get delayed. As the years went, more games will either get released as regular N64 games, be developed for another system entirely, or outright cancelled. Even games that were set to be system sellers like Mother 3 would also end up getting delayed, causing the 64DD to also get delayed as a result. With each passing year, the press began to hear less and less from the add-on, with some even wondering if it was silently cancelled. However, the 64DD would eventually be released in December 1999, but only exclusively to Japan, with no plans of it being released worldwide. While the 64DD still lacked games, it did have some neat things going for it. The add-on was launched with a subscription to RandNet, which allowed users to browse through the internet through their N64, and also supported keyboard and mouse accessories. There were some games released for the system, most notably being a sequel to Mario Paint, Doshin the Giant, and SimCity 64. But unfortunately, the 64DD would end up being a massive financial failure. To put it in perspective, Nintendo shipped around 500,000 units, but judging by its RadNet subscription, they only had around 15,000 active users, which is extremely low to say the least. The failure of this add-on could be attributed to a lot of things, but most notably, the N64DD lacked a hook or even a reason to exist. Add-ons for consoles are also very risky, since they tend to have very mixed results, such as the Sega CD or the 32X, but at least those add-ons offered some games that people actually wanted to play, unlike the 64DD, which offered very little games, with only around 9 ever being released. If the add-on had not been delayed so much and actually had some games behind it, then we might have seen a very different outcome. In a 1997 interview, Shigeru Miyamoto was asked about the 64DD and what exactly it was, to which he replied, "It would have been easier to understand if the DD was already included when the N64 first came out. It's getting harder to explain after the fact." Which I think perfectly explains why it was stuck in development for so long. The 64DD was discontinued in February 2001, now only being remembered as a footnote in the N64's legacy, and a very expensive collector's item. This is yet another one of Electronic Gaming Monthly's infamous April Fool's jokes. This time around, they claimed that you could evolve your Dragonite into a Yoshi from the Super Mario Bros. Series. The player of course needed to do a lot of convoluted steps in order to unlock Yoshi, which goes as follows. You would need to own a copy of both Pokemon Red and Blue, complete the Pokédex on both games, trade a Dratini from one version to the other, then you would need to evolve that Dratini all the way to a Dragonite. After all of that, you would need to go to a specific spot in the map, give your Dragonite a Firestone, and it would finally evolve into a Yoshi. This, of course, was fake, since Pokemon rarely collabs with other games in their mainline series, and there is no data that indicates that this is even possible. But this didn't stop the rumor from going around, with some even believing Yoshi to be one of the PokeGods hidden in the game. This was a supposed leak of the then upcoming Wii Zelda game. This rumor came from an IGN message board, posting sometime before Nintendo's 2008 E3 conference, where someone under the name Kyle claims to have leaked an interview with Zelda's lead designer, Eiji Aonuma, and they talk about Project Deluge, or The Legend of Zelda Valley of the Flood. This game would have been a prequel to Wind Waker, and would have detailed the events that led to Hyrule being flooded. This game was set to have a much darker tone, since the game would have ended with the player losing a Ganon. In the prologue to Wind Waker, It states that the hero of time never arrived to stop Ganon, and as a result, the goddesses of Hyrule flooded the world in order to stop Ganon's reign of terror. This game would have also had a playable character who would have been a false hero of time, meaning he would do things that the real Link would never do, such as talk and forging his Master Sword rather than obtaining it. The game would have also had a steampunk aesthetic and would have had multiple ways to traverse around the world. Of course, this version of the game was just a hoax, as the real Wii Zelda game was announced to be Skyward Sword, which would take place at the very beginning of the timeline rather than being a prequel to Wind Waker. Skyward Sword also had a much more cartoonish tone than that of Twilight Princess or the supposed Valley of the Flood, which only proved this to be nothing more but an elaborate fanfiction. Despite this, some fans did like some of the ideas proposed, such as the aforementioned steampunk setting or even a darker story, but Nintendo would have never made a game where you ultimately lose. Even in their spin-off game, Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity was promised to be a dark retelling of the heroes losing against the Calamity, but that game turned out to be nothing more but a what-if story where you win, which disappointed many. Pokemon Black, no not that one, is an early creepypasta that tells the story of a video game collector's playthrough of a strange counterfeit Pokemon game. The game was the same as Red or Blue, but with the only difference being that you had a Ghost Sprite Pokemon as one of your permanent team members. The Ghost Sprite also had a move called Curse, which would one-hit KO any Pokemon, but you were also able to use the move on trainers, which would cause them to disappear from the overworld entirely. Not wanting to abuse this mechanic, the player avoided this move as much as he could, but he would only use it periodically throughout this playthrough. But the big twist comes at the very end of the game, where you are suddenly transported into the far future. The player now plays as an old man, having to travel a now empty Kanto with the Lavender Town theme playing non-stop. The region will also have gravestones scattered around the locations where the trainers once were. The player continues to explore the empty world until they finally arrive at Palatown. Upon entering their room, they are shown a long cutscene on all the Pokemon and trainers they use the move Curse on. All the while, the Lavender Town theme gets more and more distorted. At the very end, they enter an encounter with the Ghost Sprite. The player tries to fight it, but nothing you do against it works. They try to run away, which also fails, and eventually, the Ghost Sprite uses the move Curse on them. The game then fades to black, and nothing. When the player restarts their game, their save file would be wiped, almost as if nothing had happened. Unfortunately, according to the author, they ended up losing their copy of the game during a move, with the only piece of evidence being this photo. How convenient. This story, despite being really cliched by most creepypasta standards, actually holds a soft spot in my heart, since it was the first one I ever read. I also enjoyed that this story didn't go off the rails, unlike other worse video game creepypastas tend to do. It just tells a very simple premise with a neat twist at the end, which I think does wonders for this story. And of course, as with other video game creepypastas, fans have recreated these games into playable ROMs. In Kirby and the Crystal Shards, or Kirby 64, one of the worlds you visit is Shiver Star, which, if you look closely, has a striking resemblance to Earth. This caused many fans to theorize that Shiver Star is actually Earth after a cataclysmic apocalypse that caused the world to get frozen over. This of course is just a theory, since it has never been outright confirmed by Nintendo, even if they do have a tendency to set their games in a post-apocalyptic world. Some fans also speculated that Earth might have had a nuclear or other man-made disaster which caused the world to be frozen over in the first place. This is as far as the theory goes, since again, it's just a theory, but it would not be out of line with the Kirby universe, which has a surprisingly deep and dark lore at times. In the Pokemon games, Magikarp is one of the weakest Pokemon in the entire series, having very low base stats and a very pathetic move pool. It does have a very strong evolution with Gyarados, so most people forgive it for being such a terrible Pokemon. But if you know anything about competitive Pokemon, then you know that it's possible to not only make Magikarp really strong, but also be able to sweep entire teams, including legendaries. This isn't a foolproof strategy, since it requires a lot of setup to be able to pull off, and a competent opponent can easily shut this down. But if you do pull it off, then it's quite the spectacle to behold. I also think most people are made aware of this thanks to this video by Pimp Knight that shows off this strategy in full succession. He's also made similar sweep videos with other bad Pokemon, such as Caterpie and everyone's favorite, Shuckle. You can technically do this with any other weak Pokemon, such as Rattata, who has the Fear Strat, which basically makes it so a level 1 Rattata is able to take down any Pokemon way above its own level. It's very amusing to see the strategies that people develop in order to make some of the weakest Pokemon be able to tackle just about any team. Also, this isn't part of the Iceberg, but during the Sun and Moon era, they introduced a mechanic called Z-moves. This allows the player to use a 5th move that jacks up the power of a standard move, including the most useless one being Splash. Using the move Z-Splash raises your attack stat by 3 stages, which makes it one of the most overpowered setup moves in the entire game. When Nintendo was still in its early years of being in the video game market, they had their first true success with the Donkey Kong arcade cabinet. This game had you playing as Jumpman, climbing up multiple construction sites and dodging obstacles in order to rescue Pauline from the treacherous ape Donkey Kong. The premise obviously takes inspiration from the King Kong film, with both medians having apes as adversaries who have a fondness for kidnapping women. But other than that, both properties are different enough that no one dumb enough could possibly confuse them. Which is exactly why Universal, the movie studios behind the iconic film, decided to sue Nintendo over copyright infringement. According to Universal, Donkey Kong reused the storyline of King Kong, and so they had the legal rights to sue Nintendo for infringement on their property. This legal case was a very intimidating prospect for Nintendo, since they were still new to the video game industry and already had to face such a tough legal battle with a giant corporation. At first, Nintendo's attorney, Howard Lincoln, was willing to settle the case, but decided to fight against it since he felt they were legally in the right. After multiple meetings, Nintendo and Universal never reached a settlement and thus decided to go to court. Howard Lincoln went on to hire John Kirby to represent them in their legal case, who was a very successful lawyer and had represented many corporations in the past, so Howard felt more confident in being able to win this case. They also had a strong feeling that Universal didn't actually own the rights to King Kong since that character was under the public domain, meaning anyone could use the character without fear of being sued over infringement. The trial only lasted 7 days, during which Universal alleged that consumers could confuse both characters as being the same, while also stating that Donkey Kong had a similar plot to the film. Shigeru Miyamoto was even questioned about the development of Donkey Kong, stating that he did take some inspiration from the name of King Kong. Kirby went on to dispute most of the similarities, but the big bombshell being that he brought up another case, in which Universal sued RKO over the rights of King Kong being in the public domain, and won, meaning that Universal did not hold the rights to King Kong either. In the end, the judge ruled in favor of Nintendo, stating that Universal did not in fact own the rights to the King Kong name, and that both properties were different enough not to be infringement. A comparison of Donkey Kong and King Kong reveals equally great differences. Donkey Kong is comical and entertaining. The farcical, childlike, and non-sexual Donkey Kong creates a humorous impression. The Donkey Kong gorilla is thus quite different from King Kong, a ferocious gorilla in quest of a beautiful woman who goes on rampages. At best, Donkey Kong is a parody of King Kong, but a parody of this is not an infringement. Universal would try to appeal the case by showing instances of the public being confused about both properties, and even did a telephone survey trying to prove their point. The court did not find this evidence to be persuasive, and upheld the decision that Universal still didn't have the rights to King Kong. Nintendo would go on to make a counterclaim, allowing them to claim damages over the case, as well as further instilling their rights over their own original character of Donkey Kong. Funnily enough, during this debacle, Universal would release a King Kong game that was a complete ripoff of Donkey Kong. The court would go on to claim that Universal's game was in fact infringement on Nintendo's copyright, which is just an amazing turn of events. So Nintendo won the case, giving them a strong foothold in the American video game market. They would also go on to thank the work of John Kirby, paying him $30,000, as well as gifting him a sailboat christened the Donkey Kong. It has also been long rumored that Nintendo would go on to name Kirby after the lawyer, who was allegedly sent a copy of the first game, which if true, is very adorable. Nintendo would go on to be the arbiter of fair use and never do anything scummy with their properties. Nintendo games have always been a popular topic when it comes to creepypastas, having inspired some of the most infamous stories, such as Ben Drowned, Godzilla NES, and various Pokemon related stories. But there's one creepypasta that always got under my skin, and it was the story simply named Mario. This creepypasta was first discovered in SMW Central. One day, while moderating, a user discovered a strange ROM hack, simply called Mario. This caught their attention since the title was so vague that the ROM hack could realistically be anything. Upon downloading the game, there was a text file that contained a bunch of gibberish. But at the top of the text file, it read out "Find me" over and over again. Upon launching the ROM, the title was replaced with just Mario. And when entering the first level, it heavily implied that Mario might actually be the antagonist of the game. Everything about the game felt off. Mario's sprite seemed slightly grayer than usual, the levels were empty and had different names, even the hint box displayed strange messages. Despite this, the author continued, and upon defeating the first boss, there was another strange message that seemed to be a medical examiner report of victim number 1, going into the detail about how the victim's eyes were gouged out, with unidentifiable fingerprints covered all over the corpse. The game then has one final level, which is seemingly another empty level before Mario is transported into a dark castle. But at the very end, you are left in an empty room with a bottomless pit. When Mario jumps into the abyss, the game crashes, ending the ROM. While the game may have a bit of an anticlimactic ending, what really skyrocketed the story was the discovery that the text file was actually a JPEG. Upon manually converting the file, it showed this disturbing image. While there was no context as to what this was, some speculated that this was victim number 1, as described earlier in the story. While this image is very disturbing, it was later confirmed by the author that this was thankfully fake. But what wasn't explained was the origin of the image. Many tried to find the original unaltered version of this photo, but to no avail. The image even predated the Mario creepypasta, as it was found first on 4chan's paranormal board, causing even more confusion as to where this image even came from. In fact, the search lay dormant for almost 13 years, with no one being able to identify the original unaltered photo. It added a bit more appeal to the story as a whole, and it's definitely one of the reasons why the story has remained relevant. But on September 1st, 2023, YouTuber Midnight Crick would upload a video claiming that they finally found the origin of the photo. It turned out to be this modified image of this woman in what seemed to be some sort of cosplay. If you want to learn more about the search and how it went down, then Midnight Crick also made a video going over the entire search. Link in the description. Even without the image, the story on itself does a good job at building suspense without turning it into silly schlock that most gaming creepypastas fall into. It's no wonder why the story has lasted so long. This is a fan theory stating that King Boo is the ghost of Bowser. This is only really supported in the Luigi's Mansion series, as King Boo is the final boss in those games, and states that he has faced Mario and Luigi many times before, despite this being the first game where he properly appears. He also wears a Bowser costume at the end of the first game, with some even mistaking this as proof that he and Bowser are the same. However, this is quickly disproven since Bowser keeps returning in the series despite being defeated many times, and sometimes in gruesome fashion. This does bring up the question of what the exact origins of Boos are, since there is some evidence that maybe suggests that Boos are the ghosts of fallen enemies. In Super Mario World, there's an entire level focused on a sunken pirate ship, which some have theorized was a ship used by Bowser and his crew during Super Mario Bros. 3. Some even speculated that the ghosts are that of the crew, with some of the enemies being Boos. Again, this is all just speculation, since there has never been a confirmation by these games, and especially since they don't exactly have the best continuity or even a story. On a similar note, Bowser has been shown to perish in some of the games, with him being dissolved to bones in some instances, becoming Dry Bowser. He was even revived by Bowser Jr. in one of the games by throwing his bones in a cauldron. On a similar note, in the very first Super Mario Bros. Game, whenever you defeat Bowser, if you defeat him using a flower power-up, you can quickly see that these are Bowser's minions in disguise. This is a neat workaround as to why you keep fighting Bowser over and over again in that game. This is even brought back in Super Mario 3D Land, where the Bowsers in those games all turn out to be imposters until you fight the real one. PokeGods are extremely rare and legendary Pokemon that could somehow be obtained through a series of convoluted steps in the first generation of Pokemon. These fake Pokemon were widely popular during the 90s, since to reiterate, it was very difficult to tell what was fact from fiction, especially in those days. These rumors widely spread mostly due to the existence of Mew, which was an actual hidden Pokemon in the game that was almost impossible to find without the use of an event or cheating device. This caused many fans to believe that there was a wide array of hidden Pokemon, and so called them PokeGods. One of the most well-known PokeGods was Meryl, who was dubbed Pikablu for having a similar design to Pikachu. Meryl was first teased in Pokemon the First Movie, and even had a trading card that incorrectly called it Pikablu. This caused many kids to believe that PokeGods were real, not realizing that it was a teaser for the second generation of Pokemon. There were many PokeGods, with most of them stemming from the anime, such as the Crystal Onyx, the weird Blastoise Venusaur hybrid, and even Ho-Oh. But of course, most PokeGods either didn't exist or were part of Generation 2. Still, the idea of PokeGods remained prevalent, even after the release of Gold and Silver, with some still believing that these PokeGods were still in Generation 1. EarthBound 64 was the original version of Mother 3 that would have been released for the 64DD add-on, but was eventually cancelled. EarthBound 64 would eventually be finished and released on the GBA, and as of the making of this video, is only available in Japan. But that's only scratching the surface, as the development for this game was rather lengthy, since this game was originally being developed for the Super Nintendo. EarthBound 64, or EarthBound 2 as it would have been known in the States at the time, was at one point being developed for the SNES CD add-on, which, if you don't know, famously never released. They resumed development for the regular Super Nintendo, but then decided to switch over to the N64 since that console was going to release soon. Allegedly, EarthBound 2 was already halfway complete, but pretty much had to start over since they would be working on a brand new console. It was also decided that EarthBound 2 would be made into 3D, meaning that the development for the game had to practically start over. It was a very difficult task, since making any game into 3D has a lot more hurdles to account for, and especially for a lot of developers at the time, who were rather inexperienced in developing 3D games. The team reportedly had a lot of trouble developing the game, since a lot of them only ever worked on 2D games, with EarthBound 64 being their first 3D game. They had some help from other studios, but for the most part, they were mostly on their own for the majority of the development. The original vision for the game was initially very ambitious, but it proved to be way too much for the N64 to handle. At some point, development switched over to the N64DD add-on, which, as stated earlier in the Iceberg, was constantly getting delayed. Even when the 64DD add-on was practically abandoned, development once again switched back to a regular N64. They did show off tech demos for the game in Space World events, which are some of the few slices of public screenshots and gameplay we have for EarthBound 64. The game was said to look amazing at the time, with many journalists being wowed at how great it looked. But for a while, they only showed trailers, and didn't have a playable demo until 1999. Eventually, EarthBound 64 would finally have a projected release date of March 22nd, 2000, but there were still reports that the game was only about 50 to 60% complete when this was announced back in Space World 1999. The game would then be delayed again, but on August 21st, 2000, it was officially announced that the game would be cancelled. In a release press statement, the game was still 30 to 60% complete and still didn't have a finalized script. The programmers also refused to rush the game, as they wanted to polish and detail the game as much as possible. It's unknown as to why they didn't just switch over development to the GameCube instead, as that was the newest console at the time. But the development team was probably exhausted at the time, and didn't want to do yet another jumping over to a newer console and starting the process all over again. EarthBound 64, or Mother 3 as it would be known now, would eventually be made for the GBA, releasing on April 20th, 2006, nearly 14 years after first being developed. Fans have speculated over the years just how much of EarthBound 64 made it into Mother 3. It's truly fascinating to see how much this game changed over the years. It was a miracle that the game even made it out, and was praised as one of the best games of all time. So good that Nintendo refuses to let it be released out of Japan. Still, I would have been really curious on how different the game would have looked and played in a 3D world, since Mother 3 pretty much plays exactly the same as the previous two games. At least we still have a lot of gameplay footage and screenshots of what could have been. Star Fox 2 is the sequel to the SNES original that was delayed indefinitely until being surprise released in 2017. The development for this game was fairly well known, as Nintendo was frequently advertising this game in Space World events and even in their Nintendo Power magazine. The game was set to utilize the Super FX2 chip, which was an amped up and improved version of the original Super FX chip that allowed the original Star Fox game to simulate 3D environments in a 16-bit console. I know that's a lot of words, but basically, it made games look cool. While development for this game went smoothly and even had a set release date of 1995, Nintendo suddenly got cold feet, since around this time, both the Sega Saturn and PlayStation were not only set to release, but had games that could run cutting-edge 3D graphics. This would have made Star Fox 2 seem really dated if released around this time. While Nintendo never officially cancelled the game, they did end up delaying it multiple times, until quietly removing it from the release schedule. What ended up happening was that rather than focusing their energy on Star Fox 2, they would rather put all their effort into the development for Star Fox 64, which was an actual jump to 3D graphics rather than the pseudo 3D graphics from the SNES. But what's even stranger was that the game was, according to the developers, around 90% complete before being quietly cancelled. Despite the game never gaining an official release date, Nintendo still decided to complete and even localize the game, which is a really odd choice. According to some of the insiders, one of the main reasons why the game was never released was due to the fact that the game would have cost more because of the inclusion of the Super FX2 chip, which would make sense since Super FX chip games were on the more expensive side, so this game would have been no different if not more expensive. Sometime after the game had been cancelled, a beta copy of the game was leaked online. This version of the game was reportedly the 90% complete version of the game that wasn't translated and had plenty of bugs left over and lacked polish. No one is really sure how this copy of the game was leaked, but one of the developers speculates that it was most likely stolen from a USB drive. Either way, fans decided to finish this version of the games themselves, giving it much more needed polish, patching out some of the bugs, and even giving this version of the game a title screen. This ended up becoming the only way for people to experience this game for a long time. That was until 2017, when Nintendo announced a mini version of the SNES, containing many classic titles from that console, but also had the surprise inclusion of Star Fox 2, fully complete and playable. This shocked everyone, even the developers, who long believed that the game will never see the light of day. This makes Star Fox 2 the last official SNES game published by Nintendo, all the way in 2017, which is a very amusing trivia fact. The game will later be added to the Nintendo Switch Online service in 2019. Kazumi Totaka is a video game composer who regularly works with Nintendo to make music for their titles. He's worked on various game soundtracks, such as Link's Awakening, Animal Crossing, and the Luigi's Mansion series. He has even voiced several characters, like Captain Olimar, Professor Egad, and most prominently, Yoshi. But one thing that most people probably know about Totaka is this little melody. This has been dubbed by fans as Totaka's song, and has been present in almost every game that Takata has been involved with in some capacity. The song is usually hidden as an Easter egg, requiring the player to do certain steps on finding the song. It could be as simple as clicking on the O in the title of Mario Paint, to as obscure as waiting 3 minutes and 30 seconds in a game over screen. Due to how random some of the requirements are to even listen to the song, it sometimes takes years for people to discover if the song is in the game. One such game was Pikmin 2, which wasn't discovered until 2019. The reason behind it was because you needed to have the GameCube version of the game. You needed to have the memory card removed and wait in a specific part of the game for a while before the song even played. Many of Totaka's songs have been found in many Nintendo games, but most fans speculate that the song only appears if Totaka has some sort of involvement in the game's music or development. Out of all his games, however, there have only been a handful of them where the song has not been found, most prominently being Wii Sports. This game is unique since it has all the check marks of him having snuck the song in, but is yet to be found. Fans have tried everything to try and find proof of the song's existence in Wii Sports, but the only lead they have is the sounds the racket makes in Wii Tennis. Some fans swear that if you clip the sounds of the rackets together, then you can hear the melody. Still, others speculate that this isn't the song, since it doesn't quite fit the mold of the song as it did in past games. So for now, Wii Sports is the most prominent game that Totakata has worked on that doesn't have a confirmed case for this little song. Maybe one day the song will finally be discovered in the most random and obscure way possible. This is a supposed cut enemy from the new Super Mario Bros. Series, which had the name of Scrupulous Fingor. When asked in an interview, Miyamoto was seemingly annoyed and disregarded the question. This was a hoax, as this was posted from a Twitter account, Cut and Obscure Video Game Content, which is a parody account that frequently posts fake videos and photos of cut content from video games. For whatever reason, Scrupulous Fingor ended up taking off, with many Twitter users and fans making fan art of the cut character. This became so widespread that some people began to believe that this character was real, not knowing that it all started from a parody account. People even started to gaslight others, as they stated that Scrupulous Fingor was in other Mario games as a cut character, making it seem like he was always there from the beginning. This character was most likely inspired by the Grumbly Simpsons hoax, in which many Simpsons fans made up a new character and started to make fan art of him being in episodes either in the background or even part of the Simpsons family. Catastrophe Crow, or Crow 64, was a cancelled game for the Nintendo 64 being developed by Manfred Lorentz. This game was described to be bigger than Banjo, and even said to rival Super Mario 64. But just as the game was set to release in 1999, the game was delayed multiple times before ultimately being cancelled. Mysteriously, the developer ended up disappearing as well. Upon further investigation, they found his game studio completely empty, with no trace of the game in sight. His house was even empty. Days after his disappearance, police found his boat in the middle of the ocean, with no trace of Manfred, only leaving behind some pile of clothes and a note with a mysterious message. Catastrophe Crow ended up becoming true lost media, with no information being made available to the public. However, on October 14th, 2020, a YouTube channel named Adam Butcher uploaded a video called What Happened to Crow 64, where he goes more in depth about the history of this lost game, and reveals that he found a developer copy of the game. I seriously recommend watching this video first, as I don't want to ruin the surprise. Seriously, watch it. If you just came back, or decided to stick around, I'm going to spoil the fun, as this game was not real, but rather an extremely well done ARG, as there is no such thing as Crow 64. This was created by Adam Butcher, a writer and director who has worked on many online projects and even directed multiple commercials. This mock video essay is so well done that it almost convinces you that this could have been real. He got so many details right on how these type of video game history videos usually go, down to the cheesy reveal that he found the only copy for the game on eBay. The video game is also extremely well done. It looks like something that would have come out of that era. The production behind this whole project is honestly amazing. The story does go beyond this video. As with most ARGs, it focuses on an internet-wide hunt that involves other YouTube channels, puzzles, and even riddles, in order to get more information on this story. This ARG has been covered from head to toe by other channels such as Nightmind and Game Theory, which helps make the story more comprehensible for smooth-brained people such as myself who don't want to do all the work. But as I was working on this video, on April 26, 2024, Adam Butcher ended up releasing a fully playable version of Catastrophe Crow, which is honestly one of the coolest things to ever come out of an ARG. The game is free and has so many secrets that it practically becomes a new ARG in itself. There is even an in-lore explanation as to how the game is available to play, which is always super neat. The story is fascinating and really well done. I do recommend checking the story out if this at all interests you. I'll be leaving links to all the videos in the description. If you couldn't guess by the title, Super Brothers is an adult film based on the Super Mario Bros. Series, or more specifically, the 1993 movie that was coming out at the same time. The plot focuses on two brothers, Squeegee and rnio, who get sucked into the computer world and are put on a mission to save Princess Perlina from the evil King Pooper. The plot is as juvenile as it gets, and apparently so plot heavy that it required two 70-minute films to do it justice. While this is nothing more than just a typical adult film parody, for whatever reason, Nintendo decided to intervene by not only buying the rights for both films, but also stopping them from even being released. So yes, technically, Nintendo owns the rights to an adult film parody based on the Super Mario Bros., which is super absurd but not completely out of left field coming from Nintendo. This made both of these films to become lost media, as outside of the title and who starred in them, little was known about him. This remained as an obscure fact until the Something Awful forums caught wind of this and went on a search for these lost adult films. It wouldn't be until 2009 when an anonymous source gave the forums a DVD rip of Super Mario Bros. 2, which finally allowed the internet to experience half of this epic adventure. Of course, this only left the first half unaccounted for, although the second film does have an extensive recap of the first movie, so at least the audience wasn't completely lost. Then, sometime in 2014, a copy of the first film on VHS was found by another user in a video store in Colorado. This later turned out to be a copy of the second movie though, which may disappoint some of you, I'm sure. But fret not, as the first part was somehow found online, so at least this grand adventure is now fully watchable. This is in reference to a YouTube video with the only thing of note being shown is some gameplay footage of Mario Kart Wii. This video is only 26 seconds long and shows a time trial race with Funky Kong where they race for a bit before falling off the edge. Despite how mundane this video may sound, for whatever reason, this video has garnered over 28 million views and still growing. This is because this video was once very rare, since the only way to view it was for it to show up on your recommended page. If you tried to search for the video, no results will pop up. This video is a bit of a mystery since no one exactly knew why this video was unsearchable or why this suddenly started popping up in everyone's recommended page. The top comment even references the fact that they were lucky enough to get the video to pop up on their feed. The reason why this video is unsearchable is most likely because it's Japanese and uses Japanese characters for the title, which is why it's unsearchable for a majority of people. Even the description is written in Japanese, and according to Google Translate, it talks about how if you dash perfectly, you cannot make the jump, which explained what is happening in the video if you weren't clear on it before. Nowadays, this video is pretty easy to find if you simply look it up on Google while adding Mario Kart at the end. On a similar topic, there's another YouTube video that shows up on the recommended page with a long Japanese title. This video is different, as it's only 15 minutes of a song from Donkey Kong Country 2 with an ambient background from one of the Bramble levels from the game. This seems pretty unordinary at first, until you read the comments, which all start with the word checkpoint, followed by them talking about something important that happened in their life. This is what many people have now dubbed as an internet checkpoint. The description goes on to state that this video was not the first of its kind, as this video was posted all the way back in 2012 before being taken down. It was then re-uploaded again in 2020 with the hopes of restarting this trend, and it worked. People are still leaving checkpoints whenever this video finds them, and it's honestly kind of amazing. Reading through some of these comments can go from being triumphant to being a bit melancholic, and it all grew organically. It also helps that the song is so relaxing that you can't help but also want to participate in this checkpoint. Kid Kirby was a cancelled game for the Super Nintendo, and would have used the SNES mouse controller. This game was being developed by DMA Design, who are most well known for the Lemmings series. DMA struck a 2-game deal with Nintendo, with their first game, Uniracers, released in 1994, being a success, but their second game, Kid Kirby, never saw the light of day. The only known information prior to its cancellation was from the Club Nintendo Mexico magazine, which had a very brief mention of the game with the presumed box art of the game. In it, we see Kirby with one strand of curly hair, which would signify him being younger, as well as a young King Dedede. Other than that, there was no real information on this game, as the game would soon be cancelled. According to one of the developers, the game was cancelled due to a combination of things, such as poor sales of the SNES mouse controller, as well as no real progress being made on the game. The story would have followed Kirby in his younger years, where he goes on an adventure before killing God. Business as usual, by the story being retold by Kirby in the present. There was a demo of the game at one point, which would have had the player controlling Kirby by dragging him with the mouse and releasing him in any direction, similar to how you control the birds in Angry Birds. The game would also use power-ups that would transform Kirby into different objects. The demo unfortunately seems to be lost, as one of the developers claims to have had a copy of the demo but is no longer in possession of it. Years later, more information would spring up as the developers began to share more about the game, sharing artwork, renders, and even stages of the cancelled game. If this game had been released, it would have been the first Kirby game to have not been developed by a Japanese company, but alas, it was never meant to be. It wasn't all bad news though, as DMA Design would later go on to make one of the most influential game series of all time, being Grand Theft Auto, and later be rebranded as Rockstar North. This is the first entry in the Iceberg that has stumped me completely, as I have not been able to find any information whatsoever on this topic. At first I thought it might have been a hoax video game title, but nothing. Then I thought it was a creepypasta based on the series, but again, nothing. I went to ask the creator on this subject, but they have also forgotten what this topic was based on. So if you have any idea what this might be related to, please let me know in the comments. Not wanting to leave you guys completely dry in F-Zero trivia though, I will instead bring up the time when Twitter was trolled into thinking that a new F-Zero game was being released for the Switch. In 2020, Twitter users noticed that a new F-Zero handle was made back in March 2020. This was also discovered around the same time when a private Twitter account for Super Mario's 35th anniversary was also discovered, having a similar handle. This caused fans to hope that Nintendo was going to celebrate F-Zero's 30th anniversary by finally making a new game for the series. But less than a week later, the F-Zero Twitter account will go on to tweet a link to an NSFW video that made a lot of fans upset that it was all an elaborate prank. The Mario Twitter account did turn out to be real though, only rubbing more salt to the wound of F-Zero fans. This is a fan theory in which some fans think that the towns in Animal Crossing are actually a cult being run by none other than Tom Nook. This theory states that you are moved away to a faraway location in order for you, the player, to be separated from loved ones and friends, forcing you to join this cult. They then put you in a lot of debt and forcing you to do mundane work to pay it off. You are also never allowed to leave, since you are using the town's form of currency, being bells, and can't buy yourself a ride back home. Of course, this is all just a fan theory that some players take way too far into trying to make it a reality. But the only real cult you're joining is capitalism. But one of the main reasons some fans accuse Animal Crossing of being a cult is because of Tom Nook, and how some players perceive him to be the bad guy of the series, since he is the one that puts you into debt and makes you work for him. The idea of Tom Nook being the quote-unquote antagonist of the game has been around since the series began, with many players hating him so much that he often shows up in multiple evilest villains lists. Tom Nook's reputation has changed over the years, since he is now seen as more passive and chill, whereas he was a bit of a hard-ass early on. This still hasn't stopped some fans from calling him the antagonist though, since he oftentimes does put you in more and more depth the longer you play the game. This is in reference to the belief that the inventor of the Game Boy, Gunpei Yokoi, first worked as a janitor at Nintendo. He would of course rise up through the ranks, becoming one of the most influential designers at Nintendo, as he would go on to invent many successful products that helped the company transition into becoming a successful video game company. As humbling as this story sounds, I couldn't find any concrete evidence that Gunpei Yokoi was a janitor when he first worked at Nintendo. The only article that I could find was on IGN, where they stated that he jumped around many jobs while working for Nintendo, including being a janitor at some point. But other sources often cite him being a maintenance worker for an assembly line where they used to produce Hanafuda cards, which were the Japanese playing cards that were used instead of regular playing cards since they were banned in Japan. I could see why people would misconstrue this as him being a janitor, but not the traditional type that most people think of when the job name pops up. Either way, Gunpei Yokoi was a man who had a knack for inventing, and this would end up catching the attention of President of Nintendo, Hiroshi Yamauchi, who was desperately trying to keep his business afloat. In most retellings of the story, they say that Yokoi was playing with a doohickey he created the same day that Yamauchi happened to visit. This inspired the president so much that he decided to make the doohickey into a toy. But in reality, Yamauchi would instead call a meeting with Yokoi, in which he asked Yokoi to make a toy to sell in time for the holiday season. Yokoi would then create the Ultra Hand, a retractable grabbing device which became a huge success, helping Nintendo pivot into the toy market. Yokoi would go on to develop many other successful toys for Nintendo, such as the Love Tester, the Ultra Machine, and 10 Million Barrels. One of his most brilliant ideas came when he apparently was on a commute home, where he witnessed a businessman playing with his calculator, randomly pressing buttons to pass time. This gave Yokoi the idea of developing a handheld device that would serve as a watch but will allow you to play games in it as well, and thus, using the same technology to make a calculator, invented the Game & Watch. These series of handheld devices basically use a monochromatic LCD screen that allowed you to play very simple but addicting games. This wound up being one of the earliest entry points for Nintendo to get into the video game market. Yokoi would eventually incorporate the first of its kind D-pad into the Game & Watch games. The D-pad would then be used for almost of all Nintendo's video game controllers, but the most important invention by Yokoi would of course be the Game Boy, which would have allowed someone to play more than one game on a single handheld device by using cartridges, similar to the NES. Yokoi wanted to make the device as cheap as he could to keep the price as low as possible. This is why he chose to make the Game Boy have a monochromatic LCD screen, like the Game & Watch. This did worry some higher-ups at Nintendo, as they feared that the technologically superior competition would outperform the Game Boy, since devices such as the Sega Game Gear would have a full-color and backlit display. But despite its inferior specs, the Game Boy would end up dominating, becoming one of the most successful products that Nintendo has ever produced, selling over 118 million units over its lifetime. Yokoi had many accomplishments while he worked at Nintendo, including creating both Metroid and Kid Icarus, while also helping on many other projects such as Donkey Kong and even the Mario Bros. Arcade game. He even helped create Rob the Robot. Yokoi went from being a maintenance worker to a general manager at Nintendo's Research and Development 1 team, or R&D1, with a high amount of accolades to his name. Unfortunately, he would end his career at Nintendo with a bit of a whimper with the release of the Virtual Boy. This was a 3D virtual reality headset that was released in 1995, which explains a lot of the reason why it failed. It also didn't help that it displayed only in black and red, which could cause a lot of headaches and eye strain if you used it for too long. The Virtual Boy was a massive flop, and soon after, Yokoi would resign from working at Nintendo. After leaving Nintendo, Yokoi was apparently working on another handheld device, but tragically, on October 4th, 1997, Yokoi and an associate of his would be involved in a car accident where they rear-ended a car. While inspecting the damage, another car would end up hitting them both, which injured the associate, but fatally injured Yokoi. He would be pronounced dead just 2 hours later. Yokoi's life was cut short, but his legacy has not been forgotten, as he is seen as one of the pioneers of the video game industry. He was a great inventor, and made arguably one of the most revolutionary inventions for the Game Boy, which helped Nintendo have a firm grip in the handheld console market. Yokoi's design philosophy would also continue to have an influence at Nintendo, as Iwata stated in an interview that his words are still being used by the likes of Miyamoto, who Yokoi was a mentor of. Super Smash Bros. Is known as the de facto crossover fighting game that many fans love to complain about. While each game is good on their own, one of the main criticisms is often lobbied at how many entries its character roster has, or more specifically, who isn't included. But before the rules were set as to who could and couldn't be included in the game, fans would often want fighters that weren't part of any video game, chief among them being James Bond. This may seem kinda random at first, but James Bond was often associated with Nintendo only due to GoldenEye for the Nintendo 64, which was one of the most popular games on that system. This caused some fans to speculate if he could be included in a future Smash Bros. Game. Once Melee was released, people expected more from the game, and it definitely delivered. But some fans were annoyed that the game had a lot of filler characters, with 6 of the new fighters being clones. Some thought that they took some of the spots from other fighters who would have been more deserving to be in the game. However, if you know anything about the development of Melee, then you would know that they had a very short development time, only having around 13 months to complete. In a Q&A with Masahiro Sakurai, the director of all Super Smash Bros. Games, he was asked about why he didn't include more characters, such as Wario. He would basically go on to state it was because making characters takes a very long time, while clones are very easy to make, since they would take less time to develop. In another Q&A, he was asked why certain characters such as James Bond were left out, to which he would respond that it was basically a no-go due to the rights nightmare of the character. Sakurai also stated that guns were a no-go in the Smash Bros. Game, which is why Snake wasn't allowed to use one in Brawl, and instead would only use explosives. This rule would be broken once Joker was added, since he just straight up has a gun, also allowing Kirby to pack heat. Even still, James Bond was requested to be included, as a questionnaire released before the release of Melee was asked of whom would be added as a hypothetical to a Smash Bros. 2, with James Bond being tied for 6th for most requested character, alongside Mewtwo, with a massive 35 votes. During the DLC development for Smash Bros. 4, Sakurai would go on to state in an interview that he would often get absurd requests for characters that originated from TV shows and movies. He would later clarify that only characters that originated from video games could be included in a Smash title, making it very unlikely for James Bond or any other pop culture character to make an appearance. GoldenEye 64 would end up getting referenced in both Super Smash Bros. 64 and Melee, since the proximity mine from the game would make an appearance, although the name was changed to Motion Sensor Bomb as to not bat any eyes, as the trophy in Melee is modeled almost exactly the same as it appears in GoldenEye, with the description talking about how spies love to use them, with its game of origin being labeled as top secret. But in Japan, the bomb resembles the mine that appears in Perfect Dark instead. The bomb would later change its appearance in future titles to no longer resemble either of those games. At least James Bond made a small cameo in a way. This is a reference to another fan theory about Donkey Kong Country, but not just any theory, a game. This theory states that Donkey Kong Country is secretly about the Banana Wars, where the US occupied multiple Central American countries in order to gain control of the exports of bananas. The video goes on to state that Donkey Kong's island is a loose analogy for the countries that were invaded, with King K. Rool being a metaphor for the United States, since he is the one who stole all of Donkey Kong's bananas. This theory is a stretch, and even MatPat states as much. But he continues with the theory anyways, going on to state that K. Rool destroyed the rail system, as well as finding and extracting oil from Donkey Kong's land. Again, this is all a big stretch, but makes sense if you ignore all logic for a moment. Sure, it could be argued that all this evidence is the true story behind DKC, but I don't think the main thing on Rareware's mind while making this game was the United States foreign policy. But all this can't sound convincing if you ignore all logic for a second. Even I began to believe it as I sit here tiredly writing this section of this video in the middle of the night. While the video doesn't outright state that this is communist propaganda, it does state that it is anti-American, which again, I thought was the purpose of this game. Plus, the Banana Wars happened during the 1890s, while communism really didn't start to spread until the Cold War. If you want to find out more about this theory, then I definitely recommend watching the game theory episode on it, because man, it's a trip. It's such a cursed video on how ancient the editing is, but it's charming because of it. This video also reminds me of game theory's other infamous theory being that Mario is secretly a communist simply because he resembles Stalin. I also recommend watching that one. Mean Girls DS was a cancelled game for the Nintendo DS, but for a long time, many assumed that this game was released and presumed lost. This game has a very surprising and complicated history for what many would consider to be a shovelware game, or a very low effort and cheaply made game. Firstly, Mean Girls is the hit 2004 film starring Lindsay Lohan and tells the story of a girl who enters the vicious world of high school cliques. The film was a huge success and is still referenced and talked about to this day, with many often calling it one of the best high school films of all time. It was because of this success that in 2009, Paramount thought it would be a great idea to release a game based on the film, as well as two other popular films being Clueless and Pretty in Pink. It was a bit odd that these games were noteworthy enough for Paramount to announce that these games were coming out. Also, many assumed that these games would either be mediocre or just straight up bad, since movie tie-in games have been notorious for being rushed products that almost never live up to the films they were based on. There is also some mild controversy over the box art of the game, as it left out the main star of the movie, Lindsay Lohan. While no official response was ever given out, many assumed it was due to the actress's many scandals at the time. Despite the amount of news coverage this game received, it would quietly disappear, with many people forgetting that it was even announced. It wasn't until years later, when lost media became popular, that people finally realized that, oh yeah, that Mean Girls DS game existed. It was then that people realized they had a hard time finding any information on the game, despite evidence of the game existing. People discovered screenshots, market listings, and even an ESRB rating, with some information on what the game might have been about. This caused many to believe that copies of the game were out there, just incredibly rare. Eventually, lurkers began to contact the developers of the game, to which they would respond that the game was cancelled and never released, which only made the mystery behind the game more lost than when it first began. And for years, this is where the search stayed, with not much progress being made. It wasn't until June 14th, 2021, when YouTuber Ray Mana would publish a second video on the lost Mean Girls DS game, revealing that an anonymous source gave her a ROM of an unfinished build of the game. While she wasn't allowed to dump the game online due to legal reasons, she did publish her playthrough of the game, which finally gave us a first-hand look at this elusive title. If you want to learn more about the search and the insanity behind it, then I highly recommend watching this two-part series. She does a better job at recapping this whole mystery and even broke ground by discovering 2 pieces of lost media, including the clueless DS game, which was also lost media. While the game is still partially lost, as the game is unfinished, it is still fascinating just how much intrigue and mystery this game produced, especially when it wasn't something that most people would have batted an eye at if it ever released in the first place. Kirby is the protagonist of their self-titled series, in which they go on a fun, colorful adventure and usually ends with him fighting a god. I wish that was a joke, but due to how powerful of an entity Kirby is, this has led to some to make the humorous observation that they are an eldritch or cosmic horror beyond human comprehension. Since Kirby's main ability is to quite literally devour and copy an enemy, this can be seen as quite horrifying if it wasn't for the fun and cute aesthetic to cover it all. We also know very little about what Kirby even is, since these games don't focus on their backstory. Some have speculated that Kirby is the same species as Meta Knight since they have a very similar body shape, although nothing has ever been outright confirmed. But what we do know is that they love food and they love to sleep. It's a good thing that Kirby is so aloof too, because if there were any amount of evil, they would for sure destroy the entire universe. Despite his mysterious origins and powers, we do know that Kirby doesn't actually digest any of the enemies he inhales, as it was confirmed by one of the directors of the series. When asked about what happens to enemies that Kirby swallows, they said that the enemies simply vanish and reappear somewhere else in the world. They also said they didn't want Kirby to kill enemies while he was doing this, as it could be seen as very jarring, which is honestly fair, as it would be very strange for Kirby of all characters to do something so violent. They were also asked what happens if Kirby were to inhale another Kirby, to which he replied that nothing happens, although it would be very funny for 2 Kirbys to just appear. While Kirby may not be the abomination that so many claim they are, that doesn't stop the Kirby lore to quite literally turn into cosmic horror. Again, I'm not joking. If you're interested in Kirby lore, then there are plenty of videos that go over the surprisingly deep lore, which may even give Dark Souls lore a run for their money in terms of complexity. I'll be linking some videos just so you too can get a taste of the insanity. Links in the description. This is in reference to yet another hoax, once again dealing with the Zelda franchise. Apparently, in 2005, an eBay listing popped up for a beta copy for a game called Zelda 3, the Triforce Saga, causing a lot of fans to get very curious. Before A Link to the Past was released, the Zelda series used to go by a numerical sequence, at least when it came to the main series, as Link's Adventure went by Zelda 2. So around the time that A Link to the Past would have been in development, it probably would have gone with the codename Zelda 3 before being changed. So this cartridge being released could have been an original version of that game. This was met with some skepticism, as there is no real evidence of this game going by this title at any point of development. Upon further investigation, users in an online forum began to notice irregularities with the listing, as beta copies for the NES would not have been playable on regular hardware. Furthermore, we know that Zelda 3 would not have been in development for the NES, as A Link to the Past was being developed for the Super Nintendo, proving once and for all that this was nothing more than a well-done hoax. Despite this game being fake, I would be very curious on what a hypothetical Zelda 3 would even be like. For the uninitiated, A Link to the Past is actually a prequel, and as the series progressed, we still haven't gotten a third game to the original first two games. With how convoluted the Zelda timeline is, it would be pretty amusing to make a Zelda 3 and see how confused the general public would be. I personally think it would be cool to have a game that would be a mix between traditional top-down Zelda and a side-scroller, like The Adventure of Link, and maybe even take the story in a brand new direction that doesn't solely focus on Ganon as being the main bad, similar to what Echoes of Wisdom did. Maybe even focus on Zelda being the main protagonist, cause why not? So we did talk about this in the first layer of the iceberg, so I'm not really sure what it's doing down here. Maybe it was listed twice by accident, but it's all good. To recap, Super Mario 64 2 was the intended sequel for Super Mario 64, set to release for the DD add-on. Development for this game was well known, as it was announced by Nintendo in multiple Space World events, magazine ads, and interviews. Little is known about this game, as it would be soon cancelled due to the financial failure of the DD add-on. Despite this, we do know that this game would have had a playable Luigi, as well as allowing for a multiplayer function of some sort. And that was pretty much all that was known about this game. Super Mario 64 2 would later be changed to Super Mario 128, which, as explained in the first portion of the iceberg, will eventually evolve into multiple different projects that is vastly different from the sequel it was originally intended as. And while not an outright sequel, the Nintendo DS remake of Mario 64 would carry elements from this scrap project, such as multiple playable characters, new levels, and even a multiplayer function. While this game was cancelled, a 64DD version of this game was found in the wild in a game store in Japan. Videos of this version of the game are available online, but it isn't too different from the main version of the game, aside from some bugs and unfinished assets. Super Mario RPG is a beloved SNES classic that remixes the Mario formula by instead making it play like a traditional turn-based RPG with a small twist. The game is definitely one of the best SNES games, and Mario translates surprisingly well into the RPG formula. While this game has had spiritual successors with the Mario and Luigi series and the Paper Mario games, many have wondered if Nintendo would ever make a Super Mario RPG 2. This wouldn't be as easy, as there has always been an issue with making a sequel to this game, as this was a joint project between Nintendo and Squaresoft, now known as Square Enix. Square Enix has been known to be extremely protective of their IPs, even more so than Nintendo. So if Nintendo ever wanted to make a sequel to that game, they would have to get permission from Square Enix first. This made the potential sequel to Super Mario RPG very unlikely for many years, especially when both companies' relationship was a bit rocky to say the least. Still, many fans have hoped that an eventual sequel would be released, with even one of the directors claiming that he would like to make a sequel before retiring. Super Mario RPG did eventually get a remake for the Nintendo Switch in 2023, which is the most attention the game has gotten in years. The game also got really good ratings, which shows that there's still a want for a traditional Mario RPG, and hopefully we'll get a sequel one day. Editing Geo here. I just wanted to quickly add that apparently Paper Mario was originally being developed under the name Super Mario RPG 2. It was being developed for the N64 DD, but it was released as a regular N64 game like every other DD game. I wouldn't have added this if I didn't accidentally find this ancient trailer with the original name. So yeah, have this extra little edit, I guess. This has to be one of my favorite urban legends in recent memory. For those of you who don't know, the whole iceberg phenomenon can be traced back with the Super Mario 64 iceberg, which was first posted on 4chan before being cross-posted to Twitter, to which it then exploded in popularity. This iceberg would then be turned into a video by and now we have a whole new genre of oversaturated videos, mine included. Anyways, one of the entries on that icebergs happens to be the Wario Apparition, which is how many learned of this urban legend to begin with. The legend states that in very rare instances, Wario's head would appear to the player before saying his now iconic line, before chasing the player and presumably killing them. This urban legend is also tied to other creepypastas and other conspiracy theories involving the game, such as the now infamous every copy of Super Mario 64 is personalized, which we'll get into in a later entry. This of course is all a lie, but people love this idea, and the Wario Apparition is often tied to the saying, which explains why some people supposedly run into this mysterious apparition. The true origin comes from this E3 video, where a short of Charles Martinet, voicing Wario, berates the audience before starting the presentation.
Ah, this is terrible. Boy, who would buy stuff like this anyway? Oh, what? You think this is fun? You gotta be cuckoo crazy. You want fun? Wario show you fun.
Despite this being debunked, many fans still made many fan edits of the Wario apparition supposedly appearing in the game. Also, this has nothing to do with the entry, but I found this video of a Wario animatronic from E3 2001. In Pokemon X and Y, there was an alleged rumor that the elusive Pokemon legend, MissingNo, is a hidden Easter egg in Luminous City. MissingNo was talked about in the first layer of the iceberg, but if you need a quick refresher, this is an infamous glitch that was very easy to access and allowed you to do all sorts of wacky stuff. MissingNo had many different sprites, but the most well-known version is of this L-shaped block of static. So when a similar L-shaped figure was spotted in a certain corner of Luminous City, many fans were sure that this was intended as an Easter egg, especially since X and Y had a very heavy focus on Kanto nostalgia. But in a short video by Boundary Break, he would go on to show that this L-shaped shadow is not in fact MissingNo, but instead, just a shadow of a door. That was anticlimactic. Sometime in the early 2000s, an eBay auction for Kirby Red Diamond for the GBA popped up. This perplexed many fans of the Pink Puffball, as there seems to be no mention of this game's existence from Nintendo or HAL. What's stranger is that the auction ended early, making some wonder if the game was actually bought, or the game's listing was taken down by higher-ups at Nintendo. Like other entries in this iceberg, this turned out to be yet another hoax. Once fans actually got their hands on the GBA cartridge, they soon realized that the game was nothing more than a bootleg version of Kirby's Adventure for the NES. My guess as to why this is so low in the iceberg is because when this was initially posted, there was an uncertainty of what games were even real. There was still a huge subsection of players that didn't know that certain games were never ported over to the States, so if a game like this were to pop up, most assumed that these games were real. While researching, I did end up finding an old forum post that I'm pretty sure was written by a kid or by someone who doesn't have the best English. It was very amusing that they made a whole webpage just to debunk the existence of this game, and there was a need for these type of websites to even exist. In Mario 64, there's a hidden room which contains a single portrait of Bowser and is supposedly found through the most obscure methods. This was made prominent through the Super Mario 64 Iceberg, and caused many people to suddenly recall such a room, but this is in fact just a hoax made by Chris O'Neill, who famously voiced the Yeti in Smiling Friends. He then tragically exploded in a Nintendo 64 related incident. There's nothing much more to add here, and I'll just play a clip from the man himself explaining why he made it.
Well, I saw your fake Mario 64 hoax where he was just in a room looking up.
Did you see that?
Yeah.
How did you see that?
You sent it to me. It's
The-
just a tiny gray room.
Yeah, it's just no point. I was like, I found this room where you could see Bowser.
There's nothing there. This is all he can do.
I made this fake fucking screenshot, and I was like, yeah, they'll all believe me now.
Is that what you came up with?
Because it's believable.
Because everybody I knew. How's that believable?
Why wouldn't it be?
Oh no, not the Bowser room.
There's
this
no-
was Miyamoto's favorite.
That's what game fucking Easter eggs always are. They're always completely pointless.
He will be missed. Some fans decided to recreate the Bowser room in all its glory, with the late Chris O'Neill even acknowledging it from beyond the grave on Twitter.com. Pokemon Go is the famous mobile app that first launched in 2016. Despite it being nowhere near the popularity it once had, it continues to stay strong, with a dedicated player base, frequent updates, and many events. A bit too many if you ask me. But one thing that Pokemon Go likes to do is to give out event-style Pokemon, which either means increasing the spawns of rare Pokemon, or giving out Pokemon with cosmetics. But one Pokemon, or rather glitch, that many fans have wondered would ever make an appearance is MissingNo. Because it can't be a Pokemon game without the inclusion of this glitch, I guess. There have been many clickbait videos of people claiming to have found the real MissingNo, but of course, it's almost always a hoax. Although this particular video is a deliberate callback to those playground rumors, so it gets a pass. To once again refresh you on MissingNo, even though we just covered it not too long ago, this was a glitched Pokemon that was present in the first generation of Pokemon due to a coding error, since Gen 1 is full of many bugs and glitches. What made MissingNo appear was due to the game thinking that a Pokemon generated over the original 151, but since the game only had 151 Pokemon at the time, the game rolls over to 0 and generates the now infamous glitch. Still, many articles continue to claim that fans have found MissingNo, with screenshots of glitched Pokemon that they found in the Pokemon Go subreddit. But again, a glitched Pokemon is not MissingNo, but people still spread it around for some reason. Fans have wondered if Niantic would ever give a nod to the legend, as it would be fun if they included a Pokemon wearing a MissingNo hat, or even make all Pokemon sprites appear as MissingNo as an April Fool's joke. A Pokemon Go entry back-to-back, how fun. This theory basically speculates that Pokemon Go is a form of spyware used by the CIA to do something with it. Probably spying. This isn't much of a conspiracy theory though, as most people know by now that phones do in fact spy on us to a certain extent, though I do doubt that it's been used by the CIA exclusively. Most apps nowadays are built in such a way that basically allows them to spy on people if they so wanted to. It's not a creepy fact at all. But since Pokemon Go is an AR game, it has caused it to get a bit more scrutiny than it would have otherwise. One of the main features of Pokemon Go is that it uses your real life location whenever you play it, which basically means that the game uses your GPS, allowing the app to always track you. It also uses your camera if you want to use the AR mode, which allows you to see the Pokemon you're capturing in real life. Pro tip, never use this feature. It sucks and it makes it way more difficult to catch Pokemon. It's due to these features that it caused the game to get a lot more criticism. Since the game encourages people to go outside, it led to an uptick in injuries and even deaths caused by people playing the game. The game also received massive controversy when players began to catch Pokemon in memorials for national tragedies, which Niantic, the developers for the game, would later turn off the spawns for. But since the game did track your location, it raised a lot of security risks for governments around the world. The game was outright banned in Iran, with them citing the game to be a security risk, with many other countries banning the game from being played inside government buildings. The game was also banned from being played at the Pentagon, with them also citing security concerns. While the game isn't necessarily being used by the CIA to spy on the players who use it, the game has been seen as a massive security threat to multiple governments around the world, even the US, funnily enough. Nintendo hosted the Super Smash Bros. Slamfest 99, or most commonly known as Slamfest 99. This was a promotional event meant to advertise the North American release for the first Super Smash Bros. Game, and it was a wrestling match set between Mario, Donkey Kong, Yoshi, and Pikachu. Most notably, they seemed to reuse the same costumes that were present in the now famous Smash Bros. Commercial. The event was being held at the now defunct MGM Grand Adventures theme park in Las Vegas, and despite the event being live streamed, no existing footage of the event has been preserved. This event was initially very obscure until a viral tweet of the event was posted sometime online in 2020. While we know that the event was posted somewhere online, the link to that video had been long taken down. Thus, a manhunt for any information on the lost video began. There were first-hand accounts for the event, which described how the whole wrestling match unfolded. The fight reportedly lasted around 17 minutes. There was a tag team fight with Mario and Yoshi teaming up to fight against Donkey Kong and Pikachu. The fight would eventually devolve into chaos, before all combatants would run into each other head on and knock each other out, ending the fight in a draw. At first, this is where all the information dried up, and it wasn't until 2023 that high quality photos from the event would be shared online, which is the best look we have gotten at this wrestling match. And you could even make out some of the scenes as described by first-hand accounts. This has all been a huge effort by the Lost Media Wiki, as they continue to investigate more of this event, which has gradually led to more information from this event being discovered to this day. YouTuber and Lost Media enthusiast El Supersonic Q has spearheaded the hunt, with him releasing frequent updates and videos on where the search for the lost Slamfest 99 is currently at, with him speculating that it's only a matter of time before a recording is found. There has been a lot of progress made with this lost event, and I wouldn't be surprised if another breakthrough about the event comes soon. During E3 2016, an alleged heist took place, in which a 17-year-old hacker tried to steal a demo version of the then upcoming Breath of the Wild. This hacker was going to use an exploit for the Wii U, which, side note, I completely forgot that Breath of the Wild was originally a Wii U exclusive. Anyways, this exploit would have allowed the hacker to basically copy any data from the device over the internet, and then he would have presumably leaked the demo online. The plan was simple. Just go to the Nintendo booth and perform an elaborate exploit without being caught. The hacker would soon run into problems, as the demos were not using retail units, but instead kiosks, which would be a lot more annoying and time-consuming to crack. This caused the hacker to stop his plan and try again the next day to update the program. He would also get help from other hackers online to try and make the process to go as smoothly as possible. On the second day, the hacker was able to successfully perform the exploit without being caught. This would have been the end of the mission until he realized that he copied the wrong files. He would now only have one more day to try and steal a demo, but on the final day, the line for the demo was packed, and thus, he had no chance to try one more time to steal the demo. There have been some people who doubt this story, as it simply sounds too good to be true. For one, anyone who's tried running exploits on a Wii U would know that it's a rather lengthy process, and would be extremely difficult to pull off without being caught. While the hacker claimed that he was able to pull it off unnoticed, due to the high amount of traffic the Nintendo booth was getting, it is strange that no one else witnessed him performing these exploits. It was also rather convenient for them to go on the booth for 2 days in a row, but not on the third, despite this being one of the most popular attractions of the whole show and would have seen the same amount of traffic for those 3 whole days. But to the hacker's credit, it seemed like other attendees did have a lengthy amount of time to play around with the demo. A video from GameXplain shows them playing the demo for around 19 minutes, and I'm sure people got around 30 to 45 minutes of playtime, so I'm sure the hacker would have been able to pull off the exploit and not get caught. This isn't actually the first time a heist for an E3 demo has occurred. A demo for Metroid Prime 3 Hunters will end up getting linked online, as well as one for Skyward Sword. So this story isn't too far out of the ordinary. Unfortunately for the hacker, he was unsuccessful, but he could have pulled it off if he was more prepared for some of the hurdles and didn't have to make last-minute decisions that prevented him from achieving their goal. In the first layer of the iceberg, I brought up how Nintendo was first primarily known for making Hanafuda cards, which are high-quality cards that display many forms of art, including flowers, trees, and animals. They were primarily used as a replacement for playing cards, since those were banned in Japan sometime in the 1600s. Nintendo would manufacture these cards as a simple form of art, but they were primarily used for gambling. According to multiple sources, many developers of Hanafuda cards were scared off on making them for being a bit taboo, but Nintendo defied this and continued to produce them despite the negative association with gambling. This would end up drawing the attention of the Yakuza, who would end up becoming one of their primary demographics, although unofficially. The Yakuza are a criminal organization, with many often describing them as the Japanese mafia. Needless to say, it led to many people associating Hanafuda cards with gambling and with the organization as well. There is even a supposed connection between the name Nintendo and the Yakuza. While no one exactly knows what Nintendo stands for, the most accepted meaning is usually along the lines of "leave luck to heaven," but some people have speculated that Nintendo is an abbreviation for various things. Some Yakuza members believe that the word nin is in reference to the word chivalry, which they often view themselves as, while the word ten could be in reference to their old Tengu cards, which were the cheaper mass-produced cards that Nintendo would sell for the purposes of gambling. I am scratching the surface of this since I am not a Japanese expert, So if you would like to know more about the language and the meaning behind it, then I highly recommend reading through this article that goes more into detail about the whole deal. While gambling and the Yakuza may have contributed to Nintendo's early success, this wouldn't be the last time that the company would be associated with the organization. During the 1960s, when Nintendo was actively trying to pivot to another market, they would venture into making love hotels, which were rooms where couples would rent for the purposes of, as the name suggests, making pancakes. While this venture never took off and was seen as a financial failure, there were some supposed ties with the Yakuza, as they would use these hotels to run a prostitution ring, with Nintendo being aware of this and simply choosing to ignore it. Eventually, Nintendo would find success when they ventured into making toys, then find even greater success when they went all in on the video game market. But Nintendo hasn't forgotten about their playing card roots, as they continue to make playing cards to this very day. They even recently revealed that the Nintendo Museum is being built where the original factory that produced Hanafuda cards was located at. They even showed off that in one of their floors, you can interact with Hanafuda cards. Nintendo would end up cutting their ties with the Yakuza around the time when they started to produce toys. Nintendo would also make it an official policy that any Japanese partner could not be associated with the Yakuza, separating them even further from the organization. While the Yakuza isn't exactly the main reason why they continue to be successful, it can definitely be seen as one of the reasons Nintendo even started as a company to begin with. I'm not exactly sure what this is an exact reference to, but I will try to explain what it may mean. This could either refer to what a potential sequel to Super Mario Galaxy would be, with many assuming the next big step for the franchise being for Mario to explore the whole universe, which as we all know is bigger than a galaxy. This will probably never happen though, since if Nintendo wanted to make another sequel, they will most likely just call it Super Mario Galaxy 3 instead of Universe. But this could also be in reference to the ending of Super Mario Galaxy, which is surprisingly vague for a Mario game. At the end of the game, you of course defeat Bowser and save Princess Peach. But just as things are wrapping up, suddenly, the final galaxy implodes, becoming a supermassive black hole. This would be the end, and the Lumas sacrifice themselves in order to stop the black hole. As a result, they end up creating a new universe, with Rosalina going on to explain that this is the beginning of a new cycle for the universe. You then wake up at the beginning of the game in a seemingly new universe. This sounds insane, but also makes more sense if you think about the game's sequel, which tells a more simplified version of the first game's story, but with some slight tweaks. There are new levels, new characters, and even a Yoshi who joins you on your journey. This could either be seen as lazy storytelling, or as a way to explore the universe that was created at the end of Super Mario Galaxy. The universe also doesn't end with Super Mario Galaxy 2, thankfully, and you reunite with Rosalina once again, who doesn't seem to remember you, but says that you were destined to meet. Again, this is all just speculation, since as we discussed in the first layer, the timelines for the Mario games don't really make any sense if you try and connect them all together. But even then, people are still not exactly sure what the ending for Super Mario Galaxy 1 exactly meant, since the storyline isn't exactly the most complex. At the end of the day, the game story is only really there to get Mario to be in space. So, I accidentally ended up explaining this entry in the very first part of the Iceberg. To quickly recap, L is Real was a very famous hoax for Super Mario 64, in which people claimed that Luigi could be unlocked through a series of convoluted steps. The most prominent of these theories had to deal with the fountain in the courtyard, that some players assumed had a hint towards unlocking the Green Plumber, spelling out L is Real 2401. Since this was just a hoax, there was no actual condition to unlock Luigi, and instead will always lead to nothing. Years later, the Nintendo Giga Leak would occur, which saw a metric fuck ton of Nintendo's information get leaked to the internet. While there were many discoveries about many games, the one that caught many fans' attention was the revelation of Luigi being in an early development build of Super Mario 64. This would also coincidentally be revealed on July 24th, 2020, or 24 years, and 1 month after the release of Super Mario 64. Not wanting to leave you guys with the same information, I'm instead going to talk about another Super Mario 64 fact that is more obscure. It is pretty well known that Super Mario 64 has a pretty active speedrunning community, with it still being one of the most popular games on speedrun.com. If you somehow don't know what a speedrun is, it's basically the act of beating a game as fast as you possibly can. There are many ways one can beat a game, from either beating the game as it was intended, or by doing a series of complex exploits, glitches, and maneuvers to beat the game way faster than intended. Due to this, many runners have almost perfected on how to take advantage of doing these tricks in order to shave seconds off their record time. This is why it's always a huge deal whenever a new glitch is discovered, as it often means that a runner can now bring the world record time even lower. This brings us to September 21st, 2013, when Dota Teabag was having a race with another runner, Midboss. Everything was going fairly normal until Teabag got to TikTok clock. As he was collecting red coins, he was suddenly shot upwards and skipped an entire portion of the level, with him being baffled and stunned at what just occurred.
What the?
Did you get invisible walls?
What?
Please say you got invisible.
No, that was the craziest thing I've ever seen though.
While this may have seemed like a random glitch, this could potentially change how certain Mario 64 speedruns are done. But, for whatever reason, the glitch has never been able to be replicated, like shown in the video, and it's a bit of a mystery as to how and why it exactly happened. Then on August 4th, 2015, a very prominent Super Mario 64 player named
Panon Koek
would release a video where he made a $1,000 bounty if anyone could replicate the glitch that Dota Teabag performed by accident, now called TTC Upwarp. Koek has stated that the bounty would have been claimed once he changed the title of the video, but 9 years later, the bounty has still not been claimed. Many players have tried and failed to replicate the glitch, with many theories springing out as to how this even happened. One of the leading theories behind the upward was that it was caused by a sudden change in the byte counter of the game. I'm not an expert on how byte counters work, but my simplistic and dumb way to explain it is that the counter basically keeps track of the logic of the game. If this counter is interfered with in unintended ways, it can cause a lot of weird stuff to occur in the game. There was a video by
Uncommentated Panon
where they almost replicate the glitch by doing a bit flip, which shows an almost exact replica of the glitch as seen on the video. But this is not a successful recreation of the bounty, as the description states that it was only speculation as to how this was performed and was achieved by manually changing the byte. But another big theory that has taken the internet by storm is that a cosmic ray hit Teabag's copy of Super Mario 64 at the time when he was playing the game, which caused the byte counter to change suddenly and fling him upwards. This seems completely insane, and yet this theory had a large group of fans that believes in it. This theory is so prevalent that articles, comments, and memes are still made to this day talking about the cosmic ray theory. While this theory is very popular, many Super Mario 64 experts don't believe this to be the only case of the glitch, with some even detesting it. One such critic, Lunatic J, who goes more into depth about the whole phenomenon, goes on into more theories as to how this happened. He talks about one potential reason behind the glitch was simply due to faulty hardware, which could also lead to byte changes. Even by Teabag's admission, he admitted that his Nintendo 64 was not the most stable. He also rips into people who spread the cosmic ray theory, since they almost seem to gloss over almost all other theories with some bad reporting and misinformation. I highly recommend watching their video, since it does an amazing job at recapping the entire saga. This is in reference to a supposed lost NES game that stems from a game listing for a mail order service from 1989. The game was named Beebiss 1, and it showed up multiple times in many listings, but this game listing would end up being forgotten about, and would have remained as an extremely obscure title until interest in the subject peaked for it years later. One of the earliest mentions of the game happened in 2009 in the Lost Level forums, where a user posted about an old gaming catalog from the 1990s. While there were some titles in that magazine that were never released, one user replied about the potential connection between one game and Beebiss 1. OP then replies that it probably isn't, and gives the most extensive knowledge about the elusive game, including how it kept getting listed until it suddenly disappeared. Even back then, the game was a bit of a meme, since they weren't really sure if the game was a hoax or not. The search for the game remained pretty dormant, until videos on the lost game were made and got more people interested in finding out what this game even was. Most of the known theories are listed on the Lost Media Wiki, but I will briefly go over some of the more prominent ones. One theory posits that the game was an unlicensed game, which, back in the day, if you wanted to have your game published on the NES, you had to get it officially licensed by Nintendo. This is a long story, but to make it short, this was a way for Nintendo to have control over what games got published on their platform, as well as avoiding oversaturating the market with mediocre to terrible games. It didn't stop them, but for the most part, most gaming companies complied. But the biggest reason why Nintendo did this was to make publishers pay to get their games to work on their console. This ended up causing some companies to make unofficial cartridges that could still run on the NES in order to avoid having to pay the license fee. Anyways, this theory basically suggests that this game was one of those unofficial titles, but this would be very unlikely as there seems to be no proof of this being the case. But the most prominent theory is that Beebiss 1 is a mistranslation of another game. Some have pointed out that the game, Rai Rai Kenoshi Baby Kenoshi no Amid Debukan, I don't know how you say that, could be the most prominent likely contender. Some have also theorized that the reason the game has such an odd title is because of the poor mistranslation, since Rai Rai could be exchanged for Yeah, and Baby could have easily been changed with Beebiss. Rai Rai would never get released in the States though, and remained a Japanese exclusive. This would also make sense as even to this day, there are some Nintendo games that still remain exclusive to Japan. In the end though, this is only one of the many theories, as we have so little to go off on, aside from the name. A user from the Lost Media Wiki forums would eventually get a hold of some of the people who worked on the game listings. They would go on to state that they would gather information on these lists based on multiple buyers, as well as what games are available at the time. Another former worker even stated that they would deliberately put fake games in their listings as a form of a copyright trap, which is a method used to discover plagiarism by publishing fake information. Despite these findings, the search for the lost game still remains open, as there seems to be no definitive decision on where this game stands. The Game Boy was one of the most revolutionary handhelds of all time, allowing for console-like games to be played on the go, as well as being relatively cheap. While it was technically inferior to its competition, it was built for longevity in mind, only requiring 4 batteries to power up and lasting for approximately 30 hours. Its bulky design may be seen as excessive nowadays, but there's no denying that the thing was sturdy. So sturdy that it even survived the war. The story goes that a Game Boy was caught in a blast radius of a bomb. Thinking that it was destroyed, the owner was amazed that the Game Boy not only remained intact, but it still turned on, albeit with a melted face. The Game Boy would then be shipped to Nintendo, to which they would give the soldier a new Game Boy, as well as displaying the burnt Game Boy in their headquarters in New York for everyone to see. However, this version of the story isn't entirely true. In an issue of Nintendo Power, Nintendo's now defunct magazine, they would receive a fan's request to see if they could get their Game Boy replaced. According to this fan, they were stationed in the Middle East during Operation Desert Storm, also known as the Gulf War. While there, the soldier's tent would end up catching fire, which saw some of their personal belongings, including his Game Boy, to be set ablaze. So unfortunately, the idea of a Game Boy being caught in a bomb's blast radius is false. The soldier would also confirm this in an interview with The Verge, stating that the bomb and the tent catching fire were 2 separate incidents. But still, the Game Boy did end up in a war zone, and of course, the Game Boy did in fact still turn on even after being burnt. Nintendo would go on to write a pretty funny response to the whole ordeal. When we received Steven's Game Boy from the Middle East, we thought that it was a goner. The back of the unit was in fair condition, but the front was charred and blistered from the heat of the fire. When we heard its distinctive ping, we couldn't believe it. The control pad and A and B buttons suffered meltdown, but the start and select buttons worked perfectly. Game Boy is even tougher than we thought it was. Of course, we don't recommend that you subject your Game Boy to trial by fire, but in this case, we replaced Steven's Game Boy as a special Desert Storm courtesy. Nintendo would in fact display this Game Boy in Nintendo's store in New York, not their headquarters like many suggested, even leaving it on to show how durable the Game Boy is, even years after the incident. But sometime in 2023, the Game Boy would end up being taken off display, which left many fans a bit disappointed. Upon further investigation, it was confirmed by employees that they were sending the Gulf War Game Boy back to the actual Nintendo HQ in Washington, with no confirmation as to why it was taken down. I personally think that it might have to do with the new Nintendo Museum that is opening up in Japan, which could be a nice new home, although some have suggested that maybe the Game Boy may have finally stopped working, which is a bit sad if true. Argonaut Games is a British video game developer who are most famous for working on the original Star Fox games, as well as developing the Super FX chip, which allowed the Super Nintendo to render 3D graphics. Argonaut Games has a very interesting history with Nintendo, with them first getting into contact by showing off how their game studio was able to crack the Game Boy's copyright protection. This allowed the head of the studio, Jez Zahn, to have a direct contact with Nintendo, as well as being sent over to Nintendo's HQ in Kyoto. Argonaut would end up making a deal with Nintendo, striking up a 3-game deal, as well as Argonaut developing a chip capable of rendering 3D graphics on the Super Nintendo. According to one of the developers, when the chip idea was pitched, they kinda bullshitted their way through the whole deal since they weren't really sure if they could actually make a chip to do such a thing. But Nintendo agreed to do it. Their first game was a bit of a challenge for the British team, as they had to develop a game in 2 different countries with vastly different time zones. Some of Argonaut's developers were also moved over to Kyoto. This was a bit difficult for the studio, but in the end, they did manage to pull through and worked hand in hand with Nintendo to develop Star Fox. The game was really impressive for the time. It was the first time a 3D game was able to be produced in a console, and it was extremely revolutionary. The on-rails flight shooter was also very much inspired by Argonaut's Starglider, which is very obvious when you compare both games side by side. Nintendo would then commission the studio for a second game, but as stated earlier in the Iceberg, Star Fox 2 will end up being put into an indefinite hiatus. Worse yet, some of the key developers for the studio would end up switching from Argonaut to working for Nintendo, which was a huge blow for the company. But what really destroyed Argonaut's relationship with Nintendo would end up being their failed pitched idea for a 3D platformer based on Yoshi. Jez Zahn did directly pitch this game to Nintendo, but they would end up declining this offer. I'm not exactly sure why pitching the game was enough to cause the rift between both companies, but this is all I was able to find while researching. Anyways, Argonaut would end up taking this idea to develop Croc, while Nintendo would then develop the highly acclaimed Super Mario 64. This is where the intrigue comes into play, as the head of Argonaut believes that Nintendo, or rather Miyamoto, took a lot of inspiration from the pitched Yoshi game and used it to develop their own game instead. The end came when we pitched to do a 3D platform game, the likes of which had never been done before. We mocked up a prototype using Yoshi. It was essentially the world's first 3D platform game, and was obviously a big risk. Nintendo had never let an outside company use their characters before, and weren't about to either. This is the moment the deal fell apart. He would also go on to state, Miyamoto-san came up to me at a show afterwards and apologized for not doing the Yoshi game with us, and thanked us for the idea to do a 3D platform game. While I don't necessarily agree that Nintendo outright stole the idea for a 3D platformer, you can't help but think that this could have totally been the case with how much Nintendo already took from the studio. To add more salt to the wound, Nintendo would also use a lot of their code from the delayed Star Fox 2 game to develop Star Fox 64. Unfortunately, they would end up shutting down in 2007. This isn't the end for Argonaut though, since as of 2023, they would end up bringing back the studio, as well as announcing a remaster for Croc. This is now the infamous phrase that posits the idea that Super Mario 64 contains an AI that customizes every player's copy of the game, which allows it to generate a different experience for every player. This would then explain why certain urban legends occur to some players but not be replicated in other players' games. Maybe this would explain why some players are able to actually unlock Luigi in their game, or even how the Wario Apparition would appear. Of course, this is just a hoax, but players took a liking to this phrase, which is why it stuck around. The origin of this phrase can once again be tracked back to 4chan with the Mario Iceberg image. These threads were trying to find the meaning behind every entry, with a lot of users being fixated on certain entries more than others, such as the Wario Apparition, and every copy is personalized. The most well-known explanation of this saying comes from this 4chan user, at least according to Know Your Meme, which goes as follows. Every copy of Super Mario 64 is personalized. Nintendo's experimental AI adapts and subtly creates a slightly altered version of the game tailored specifically for you. Have you ever played someone else's copy of Mario 64? Have you ever felt like something was just a little off? That's why. That's how. This is much more than just simple experimentation with procedural generation. There are many layers to this, and some of them are more sinister and malicious than others. Super Mario 64 is, at its core, an insidious and evil work of human creation. While as fun and creepy as this idea sounds, there is of course no proof of this being in the game, since I doubt Nintendo would be able to make a generative game back in the 90s. But this is all in good fun, as some fans use this as an excuse to explain why certain memories are different from the game. At the end of World War II, Imperial Japan was the last of the Axis powers still waging war against the Allies. Not wanting to prolong the war, the United States decided to use nuclear weapons in order to have a swift end to the war, dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and then dropping one on Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. 6 days after the detonation of the bombs, Japan would surrender, bringing an end to the war. But had Japan not surrendered, the US was more than ready to drop more bombs as early as August 19th. There was even a potential list of what cities would have been targeted, such as Niigata, Yokohama, and Kyoto, the last of which happens to be where Nintendo's headquarters was located. Nintendo was founded on September 22nd, 1899, and they were established in the city of Kyoto, where they still operate to this day. Kyoto is known as being one of the cultural landmarks of Japan, having been one of Japan's former capital cities until it was switched over to Tokyo. Kyoto is also known for having many Shinto shrines, most of which were destroyed during US bombings during World War II. Kyoto would have more than likely been one of the primary targets for the use of the atomic weapons, since it met many requirements for target use of the bombs. However, Kyoto would end up being taken off the list by the request of Secretary of War Harry L. Stimson. This is where the story gets a bit complicated, as historians are a bit mixed on why exactly Stimson was so adamant to take Kyoto off the bombing list. Apparently, he knew how much of a cultural landmark the city was to the Japanese people. Most famously, a rumor came about that Stimson once had a honeymoon in Kyoto, and therefore had a connection to the city and wished for it not to be bombed. This was even depicted in Christopher Nolan's film Oppenheimer, where we see this exact scene play out.
I've taken Kyoto off the list due to its cultural significance to the Japanese people. Also, my wife and I honeymooned there.
This would turn out to be false. Historian of science Alex Wellerstein would go on to detail how Stimson never had a honeymoon in Kyoto and only ever stayed there for a single night while out on a mission. It was also pointed out that the main reasoning behind taking Kyoto off the list was mostly due to strategy rather than any real connection to the city, as bombing such a landmark would have made post-war tensions with Japan a lot more difficult. There is of course much more to this story, since we only covered the surface of this topic, as there is much more thought that went into making and using atomic weapons during the end of the war. But at the end of the day, Kyoto, and by extension Nintendo, will end up being spared from such a fate. I'm surprised that it took us this long to finally cover Iwata. Satoru Iwata was the former president and CEO of Nintendo before he would tragically pass away in 2015 due to a terminal illness. Apparently, there are some people who believe that Iwata didn't succumb to his illness, but instead was assassinated by the Illuminati due to Nintendo having extremely poor sales at the time. This of course was during the Wii U era, which saw a lot of financial hardships for the company and was the first time that Nintendo, since it entered the video game market, that the company saw a loss. I'm not gonna entertain this one as it's extremely dumb and pretty disrespectful. Plus, nobody takes the Illuminati seriously anymore, as they're more seen as a meme nowadays. So instead, I'm just gonna do my best to talk about Iwata's history and his long-lasting legacy. Satoru Iwata first began developing games as early as high school, where he would make games on a programmable calculator. Iwata remarked on how one of his classmates would play these simple games that he made, and how this experience would inspire him to become a video game developer. After graduating from high school, he would go on to enroll in the Tokyo Institute of Technology to pursue a career in computer programming. Iwata was a very gifted and talented programmer, often completing assignments swiftly and accurately, and even helping out his professor on things that they didn't understand. He would also go on to develop many games at school. Iwata would go on to join a club of computer and game enthusiasts while at college, and that club would eventually form into HAL Laboratories. He would work for them part-time and eventually join them as a full-time programmer after graduating. According to him, his parents were not pleased with the idea. This didn't stop Iwata, as he would go on to truly make a name for himself. While working for HAL, Iwata would strengthen a connection between them and Nintendo, developing many games for the NES and Game Boy, such as Joust, Balloon Fight, Kirby's Adventure, and NES Open Tournament, the latter of which was an extremely difficult task programming-wise, as an NES cartridge could not hold enough data to fit an entire 18-hole course. But Iwata programmed it anyways. Iwata would later go on to become the president of HAL Laboratories, and would even save the company from near bankruptcy. Even with his higher position, he would still help his colleagues with programming, and would help his peers in developing their games. Most famously, Iwata would help out Game Freak during the development of Gold and Silver, where he would make a compression tool that would allow the game to run smoothly. Iwata also helped port the battle system from the Game Boy to the N64 for Pokemon Stadium, which he apparently did in a week, shocking the developers at Game Freak. By the 2000s, Iwata would become the first president of Nintendo that was not part of the Yamauchi family. It was under Iwata's leadership that the company would see some of its most profitable years since entering the video game market. While Nintendo was never in any financial trouble, it was struggling a bit since it was underperforming against their competitors at the time, the Sony PlayStation and the then new Microsoft's Xbox. Rather than compete with these two competitors, Iwata decided to help the company pivot from a core gamer experience to instead try and appeal to a more casual audience, since he felt that they were largely being ignored. It was under Iwata that Nintendo would release some of their most successful consoles, with the Nintendo DS and the Nintendo Wii. It was these two mega hits that really catapulted Nintendo into brand new heights, and if it wasn't for Iwata's insight, there might have been a huge chance that they would have been edged out of the market, similar to what happened to Sega. Iwata would also greatly differ from past presidents, as he decided to personally meet with Nintendo's different departments and employees. It was this openness and friendliness that perhaps helped Nintendo bolster its morale and creativity during its time. Iwata would also depart from his predecessors by having more public appearances, as well as being a frequent speaker at conferences and game shows. On top of that, Iwata would also start an interview series called Iwata Asks in 2006, which allowed the public to have more insight on Nintendo's games and systems, and also allowed developers to share more background information and history on some of their older titles. It was because of these interviews that the public kinda got a taste of what Iwata was like as a boss, as these interviews would often have a very comfortable environment, with so much laughter being transcribed into these interviews that Iwata laughs became somewhat of a running meme. Speaking of which, Iwata was no stranger to the internet, as he would often become the source of many internet memes. One example of this is one of his catchphrases,
"Please understand,"
which he often stated after announcing that a game would be delayed, or even when he held up a bunch of bananas for a prolonged period of time for no apparent reason, or how he would raise his hands parallel to each other during Nintendo Directs.
"Directly to you. Directly to you. 直接."
It was his many mannerisms and catchphrases that caught the eye of many gamers, who would find his presentations very charming and earnest, only bolstering Iwata's public appearance. It was also under Iwata that Nintendo would transition from an in-person press conference at E3 to online-only presentations, which at first were seen as a bad sign for Nintendo, but has now become the standard for every video game company. It was also because of these online events, or Nintendo Directs, that we would see even more memes come from them. But not everything was good under Iwata's days as CEO, as Nintendo would soon begin to struggle at the beginning of the 2010s. For one, The Nintendo 3DS was seen as a huge disappointment, as although it did have revolutionary technology, the lack of gains and price on release caused the 3DS to fail to catch on with general audiences, at least early on. While the 3DS would eventually grow and recover from its abysmal start, the same could be said for Nintendo's biggest failure. The Wii U was a big step up from the Wii in terms of graphics, but the gimmick and confusion of what the console even was caused it to flop hard. It was so bad that Nintendo actually saw some of its first financial losses since entering the video game market. Rather than fire their employees, Satoru Iwata would instead cut his salary in half, as well as cutting some of their board member salaries by 20 to 30%. But once the 3DS began to perform better, as well as the release of Super Smash Bros. 4, that Nintendo would finally recover from this financial slump. It was also around this time that mobile games were taking over the market, and Iwata was a bit hesitant to port games over to mobile, as although the market was exploding, he didn't want to dilute the Nintendo brand. This was seen by many in the industry as a bad move, since many were declaring that mobile gaming was the future of gaming, and that consoles were soon going to be irrelevant. But maybe due to some of its financial troubles, that Iwata would later change his mind and strike a deal with DNA to develop new mobile games with Nintendo's IP, which saw the likes of Super Mario Run, Fire Emblem Heroes, and even Mario Kart Tour come to mobile. Iwata also apparently had a hand in development of Pokemon Go before it was publicly revealed in 2015. A lot of things would end up changing during 2014, as it was announced that Iwata would not make a public appearance in E3 of that year. It was stated that he would not be able to make it due to advice from his doctor. This got some fans slightly worried that something might have gone wrong. Iwata would eventually make a public appearance again in the November Nintendo Direct. While he did look well to most, some pointed out how he looked visibly slimmer than his last public appearance. But Iwata would take this in good spirits, as he would update his Mii to resemble his newer appearance. While Iwata remained in high spirits, behind the scenes, his health issues continued to grow more complicated. In 2015, he would have to leave a shareholder meeting early due to his declining health, and he would later once again be hospitalized in June of that year. While this all remained behind closed doors, the public was only slightly tipped off when the news once again broke that Iwata would once again not be attending that year's E3. Despite Iwata's declining health, he would continue to still work while at his hospital bed. But on July 11th, 2015, Iwata would pass away. He was suffering from a tumor that had grown in his bile duct, and while was treated in 2014, the problem would resurface, ultimately leading to Iwata's tragic passing. The news shared across the world on July 12, 2015. The response was one of tragedy and heartbreak, as millions of fans came out to mourn the passing of Iwata. Many fans paid tribute in many ways to both celebrate and show respects to an icon. Other game companies came out with statements thanking Iwata for all that he's done and brought to the community. Even at Nintendo HQ, they would fly their flags at half-mast to honor the memory of Iwata. His funeral was held on July 16th and 17th, where reportedly thousands of fans showed up to pay respects, despite stormy and cloudy weather. Most notably, Shigeru Miyamoto, Reggie Fils-Aimé, and Masahiro Sakurai were all in attendance at his funeral. Iwata worked tirelessly to reshape Nintendo into a company where anyone could play and enjoy their games, while also pushing boundaries by making consoles that were so revolutionary it revitalized the gaming industry for many. While he was the head of the company during its peak, he was also the reason why Nintendo's morale stayed strong during its hardships. If it wasn't for his hard work, Nintendo might have been in a very different place than it is today. He will forever be remembered in our hearts, and his legacy will be everlasting.
岩田さんは私に対する最大の理解者でありました。人徳者であり、不断の努力者であり、サービス精神にあふれ、ゲーム業界を変えた人でした。
On a personal level, he was my boss, and he was my mentor, and he was my colleague. But most of all, he was my friend, and I'm a better person for it. And I think every gamer is better for having Mr. Iwata's vision and talent help inspire and shape the passion we all share.
On my business card, I am a corporate president.
In my mind, I am a game developer, but in my heart, I am a gamer.
Earlier in the Iceberg, we went over Gunpei Yokoi, an employee at Nintendo who initially started working for the company as an assembly worker, before rising through the ranks and becoming one of their most important figures. He was responsible for many of Nintendo's famous inventions, but he's most well known for the creation of the Game Boy, which is still one of Nintendo's best-selling consoles of all time. Unfortunately, on October 4th, 1997, Yokoi would tragically pass away after getting struck by a car while inspecting a car accident. Despite this incident being very tragic, it was the strange circumstances of his death that led to a number of conspiracy theories that the car accident was in fact a hit job done by the Yakuza. The theory states that Yokoi's involvement in the massive failure of the Virtual Boy caused some higher-ups at Nintendo to lose a lot of money. Then, once Yokoi decided to leave the company and join another competitor in order to make another handheld system, the higher-ups, not wanting Yokoi to sell the company's secrets, decided that enough was enough and put a hit job on Yokoi. Some theories also state that since Nintendo had a close connection to the Yakuza, with some even speculating that the Yamauchi family had a very heavy connection to them despite them parting ways a long time ago, allowed Nintendo to cover the incident more easily. This of course is a load of bullshit, as there's very little evidence to support this theory, and falls apart the more you read into the story. For one, on that fateful day, Gunpei Yokoi was being driven by Etsuo Kiso, who happened to be a higher up at Nintendo. Since he was also involved in the crash, it would make very little sense to him to be close to the supposed hit job where he could have also been easily hurt. It would also be very difficult to cover up due to how many parties were involved with the incident, and would have caused a lot of attention for a supposed professional hit. What really happened on that day goes as follows. Kiso and Yokoi were driving along the expressway when Kiso crashed into a truck that was ahead of him. The expressway is extremely narrow and would be extremely easy to accidentally get hit by a car if not careful. Both Gunpei Yokoi and Kiso exited the vehicle in order to inspect the damage, along with the truck driver. It was then that a third vehicle came in and accidentally struck all three men. While Kiso and the truck driver did sustain injuries, Yokoi was struck fatally, being pronounced dead at the scene. If the conspiracy theory were to be believed, it wouldn't make sense for the Yakuza to also accidentally hit a Nintendo exec, as that will lead into more trouble for them and an even bigger mess to try and cover up. The only part of this story that is a bit suspect is that there really isn't any information on the driver who struck and killed Yokoi, which probably led to this theory getting a lot more traction than it otherwise would have. According to this article, what most likely happened was that the driver was charged with the incident, but was never made public. This article also goes on to state that if the Yakuza were to put a hit on someone, then they would have done something a lot simpler than a car crash, which, as we stated, has a lot of complications to try and cover up. While this conspiracy theory is mostly debunked, it's those tiny bits of loose detail that will probably keep this conspiracy theory from ever truly going away. Hopefully, Yokoi's legacy will be stronger than that of his untimely passing. This is a really strange one, as I'm convinced that it's both a shitpost and an actual conspiracy theory. So, according to this entry, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, the famous composer from the classical period, is not only still alive, but is living/being held captive in Nintendo HQ in Kyoto, Japan. While I was initially excited to see where this rabbit hole will lead me to, it unfortunately didn't yield much interesting results, since again, it mostly seems to be one of those elaborate jokes, where you connect two seemingly different subjects, only to realize that they do in fact have some sort of connection in the very minute details. The main theory behind Mozart being alive is that he is somewhat connected to the Pokemon series. In those games, you have three legendary birds, Moltres, Zapdos, and Articuno. But if you use the first couple of words from those Pokemon, they actually spell out Mozart. And that's pretty much it. While this may seem insane at first, one user thought to take this further, since they started to make even more connections between the two subjects. So Pokemon is given hints of Mozart being alive. Mozart is from Germany. Japan and Germany were allies during World War II. You know who else Germany was allies with? That's right, the Soviet Union. You know what the Soviet Union also had? That's right, composers. Yes, it's all starting to make sense. Well, I guess I'm beat. This of course means that Mozart is alive. On a side note, while researching, this same user pointed out how this classical piece has a striking similarity to one of Pokemon's songs. Take a listen. Again, this is all in good fun, since no one in their right mind would take this seriously, and it's mostly just a shitpost, usually making fun of people who try to make connections between stuff that doesn't have anything in common whatsoever. And this is our final entry, and it's a rather dark subject. Mario Kart GP is the arcade version of Mario Kart that can be found in any arcade imaginable. This game is notable for being the only version of Mario Kart to feature characters from third-party games, most notably Pac-Man. This game was developed by Namco Bandai, and it's a rather popular spin-off series, spawning various sequels. But rather than talk about the game itself, there were some rather peculiar images hidden in the game's files. It was discovered that the game had 3 unused photos. The first just being a series of colorful stripes, the second of 2 mascots, presumably being for Japan, and the third being a photo from the Belsen School hostage crisis. According to Wikipedia, the Belsen School siege was a terrorist attack that started on September 1st, 2004 and would last for 3 days. They wound up taking hostage of over 1,100 people, with over 700 of them being children. The attack will lead to the deaths of over 300 people, and it's still recorded as one of the deadliest school shootings in history. Now you may be asking yourselves, why a photo like this ended up hidden in the files of a Mario Kart game? And the truth is, it is most likely a mundane one. This isn't the first time something like this has sneaked its way into a game, as this image was probably downloaded while someone was working on the game and then never deleted. The timing would also make sense, since the game was being developed around the same time that the attack was taking place. This isn't the first time something rather disturbing was left in the game by accident, like the billboard in California Speed, which has a rather ominous message. So this rather disturbing photo most likely doesn't have any deeper meaning than this, which is a bit of a letdown for the final entry of this iceberg. Not wanting to end the iceberg on such a downer, I decided to add one last entry, once again talking about our good friend Iwata. Before passing away in 2015, Iwata was working on several projects, with one of them being in the early development stages for the then upcoming Nintendo Switch. While Iwata wasn't able to put much work into the console, he did have the final say in the design of the console as well as its specs. Many games were in development for the console, chief among them being The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. While this game was initially an exclusive for the Wii U, it was also decided to be a launch title for the Switch, with many even forgetting that it even came out for the Wii U. Regardless of this, the game still holds many secrets that people are still discovering to this day. But there is one secret that many believe is a loving tribute to the late president. In Breath of the Wild, the player could run into an NPC named Botrick, who many have noted bears a striking resemblance to Iwata. At night, Botrick will tell the player of the Lord of the Mountain, which is a spirit that roams around in a particular part of the mountain at night. If the player does manage to encounter this legendary steed and successfully record them into their compendium, it reads as follows. This noble creature watches over all animals that make their homes in the forest. Legends say that this creature is a holy reincarnation of a sage that died on the lands it now protects. It has an acute awareness of its surroundings, so it seldom appears before people. It's sometimes known by its other name, Satori. Many players believe this to be a direct nod towards the late developer. This wouldn't be the only nod left for Iwata, as in early versions of the Nintendo Switch would also hide a truly obscure Easter egg. If a player held both Joy-Cons and mimicked Iwata's separate hand gestures, the Switch would then play the NES version of Golf, which also happened to be the first game Iwata ever developed for Nintendo. Sadly, this would later be removed in future updates. Fortunately, the Lord of the Mountain Easter egg would still be present in Breath of the Wild sequel, Tears of the Kingdom. And that was the entire Nintendo Iceberg. If you've made it this far, then you get another cookie. The funny part is that I still have a lot more subjects that weren't included in this image. I might make another Iceberg video, but only if there's interest for another part. I will once again like to thank Invincible Elliot for letting me use his image and allow me to make this video. I would really appreciate it if you leave a like for this video and subscribe. And once again, thank you for listening and have a great day.
Introducing Nintendo Score 64 and win at Taco Bell. Just peel the coin off the lid, score 64, and you could win an N64 system, cash, or millions of other great prizes. And who knows who'll win the Porsche Boxster. It's Score 64 and win, only at Taco Bell.